Hey everyone! Tonight we're going to slowly step into the quiet, shadowy world of Viking gods and myths, a world that stretches across icy fjords, dark forests, and endless skies. It's a world where every tree, every river, every stone seems to hold a story, a memory, or a whisper from ages long ago. Before we get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Let me know in the comments where you're joining from, and what time it is where you are. It's always interesting to see the map of people drifting in from all over the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft constant hum in the background, let the quiet settle, adjust your blankets, your pillows, and allow yourself to sink into the story. Tonight, we're not rushing. We're moving slowly, gently, through the realms of gods like Odin, Thor, and Freyja, through the branches of Yggdrasil, and across the 9 worlds of Norse belief. This isn't about battles or loud adventures. It's about the calm, the intricate, and sometimes shadowy patterns of a world that humans once looked at and saw both wonder and meaning. So take a deep breath, let your mind float for a moment, and prepare to step quietly into a story that is older than the snow on the northern mountains, and as soft as the evening wind over the fjords. In a moment, we'll begin at the very start, in the quiet, open landscapes of Scandinavia, where the first whispers of Norse belief took root and shaped the imagination of those who walked among the forests and seas. The story of Norse belief begins not in a hall of kings or in the thunderous clamor of battle, but in the quiet spaces of the Scandinavian landscape, where the rhythms of nature themselves guided the lives and imaginations of early communities. Amidst the fjords that carve deep into the northern coasts, among forests that stretch endlessly with pines and birches, and over frozen plains that sparkle under a pale winter sun, the people who would later be known as the Norse began to shape their understanding of the world and the unseen forces within it. The environment was not merely a backdrop for human life, it was a living, breathing presence, a companion and a teacher. Mountains rose like silent guardians, rivers flowed with a steady, measured patience, and the wind carried across the land a sense of both mystery and permanence. In this setting, the imagination of the early Norse was naturally attuned to the presence of spirits, forces and powers that could be felt in every stone and shadow, and over centuries, these perceptions crystallized into the myths and gods that would define Norse belief. Long before written records or elaborate temples, the early Norse understood the world in terms of relationships between humans and animals, humans and land, humans and the forces that shaped the weather and the seasons. They observed the rising and setting of the sun, the cyclical return of life in the thawing of spring, and the harsh, unyielding quiet of winter. Each change in the natural world carried significance. Storms were not only meteorological events, but also manifestations of deeper powers, and rivers and lakes were seen as conduits to realms beyond immediate human perception. Over time, these observations became imbued with narrative, a quiet storytelling that explained the patterns of the world and provided a framework for living within it. In a land where survival demanded attentiveness and respect for the environment, it is natural that the Norse would come to envision deities who were not distant or abstract, but present in the snow-laden hills, in the shifting clouds, and in the rushing waters of their rivers. The people of this time were deeply connected to the land in practical ways as well. Farming, hunting, fishing, and seafaring were the occupations that defined everyday life, and each of these activities depended upon careful observation and cooperation with the natural world. In the fertile valleys, they tilled the soil and planted seeds, understanding that life came from the earth and returned to it. In the forests, they hunted deer and gathered wood, aware that taking too much or disrespecting the animals could bring misfortune. Along the fjords and coasts, they fished and navigated by the stars, reading the currents, tides, and weather with the same precision that one might read a book. This constant attentiveness cultivated a reverence for the forces that seemed to shape and guide human existence, and over generations reverence became mythology. These were gods not entirely separate from the human world, but deeply intertwined with the rhythms of daily life. Odin's wisdom, Thor's protection, and Freyja's fertility were reflections of the qualities the Norse saw and needed in the world around them. It is important to imagine these people not as isolated individuals but as communities, bound together by shared experience and observation. In longhouses, families and extended kin groups gathered, exchanging stories and passing down knowledge. The long dark winters created long nights filled with the quiet flicker of firelight, when practical instruction merged with storytelling. Tales of gods, spirits and cosmic forces were not just entertainment, they were ways of understanding causality and morality, ways of teaching patience, resilience and the consequences of human action. The environment itself was an ever-present narrator. The howl of the wind through pines might remind one of unseen spirits, the sudden appearance of a fox or raven might be interpreted as a sign, and the shifting light across the snow could evoke reflection on cycles of life and death. In this way, belief was not imposed from above, it was drawn from attentive observation, from listening deeply to the voices of the land. Over time, these patterns coalesced into recognizable figures and stories. Gods began to take shape as embodiments of qualities the Norse observed in their world. Odin emerged as the seeker of knowledge, a reflection of the quiet, reflective human desire to understand the unseen forces that govern life. Thor came to represent strength and protection, the defense against chaos, storm, and the dangers of the natural world. Freyja and Freyja embodied fertility and prosperity, linking the cycles of the earth with the sustenance of human communities. Each god was not merely a figure of imagination, but a symbol of patterns the Norse recognized: the necessity of courage in harsh winters, the value of wisdom when navigating the seas, the essential partnership with nature for survival. Even Loki, whose cunning and trickery complicated the order of things, mirrored the unpredictability of the world, the sudden storms and unexpected events that required flexibility and adaptability. It is also notable that the early Norse did not perceive the world in strict dualities of good and evil. Rather, they observed balance and interconnection. Life was a negotiation with forces beyond one's control, and understanding, respect and careful action were the pathways to harmony. This worldview created a pantheon in which gods could be fallible, destructive, or ambiguous, reflecting the complexity of nature and human experience. Mythology then was not an escape from reality but a framework for interpreting it, a meditative lens through which the Norse could process uncertainty and continuity. Through this slow, reflective storytelling, a young listener by the hearth could learn about the tides, the forests, the seasons, and also about patience, resilience, and the quiet ways in which the world maintained balance. In thinking about the dawn of Norse belief, it is necessary to picture the landscape itself as a character in these early narratives. Snow-laden mountains, misty fjords, dense forests, and vast plains shaped imagination with their presence. Life was slow and often harsh, but it was punctuated with observation, reflection, and ritual. Each ritual, from offerings to the land, to small daily gestures honoring ancestors and spirits, was an expression of connection to the living world and its divine currents. Over generations, these rituals and observations solidified into mythology, a structured yet flexible system of understanding that would endure in oral tradition for centuries, eventually finding its way into written forms like the Poetic Edda and Prose Edda. But even in those earliest days, it was the quiet, patient attentiveness of the Norse to their surroundings that laid the foundation for belief. And so, as night falls over the fjords and the snow glimmers under a pale northern moon, one can imagine the early Norse, gathering in longhouses, whispering of gods and spirits, and weaving the first threads of a mythology that would connect the heavens, the earth, and all living beings. The world itself, its forests, rivers, mountains, and winds, was not simply a setting but a living participant in these tales. In this way, the dawn of Norse belief was both a reflection of human experience and a meditation on the quiet, enduring rhythms of the natural world, a slow and deliberate awakening to the presence of something greater than oneself, patiently observed and quietly honored. As the early Norse gaze stretched across the vast landscapes they inhabited, imagining the forces behind rivers, winds, and mountains, their minds gradually took shape around a central vision: Yggdrasil, the world tree. This tree was not merely a metaphor, though it would eventually be described in tales and poems. It was a living symbol of connection, permanence, and interrelation, its branches, trunk, and roots stretching into the many layers of existence. In the quiet minds of those who first envisioned it, Yggdrasil was a framework for understanding the cosmos, a way to organize the observable world alongside the unseen realms that might lie just beyond perception. It bridged the heavens and the earth, the mortal and the divine, offering an image both grounded in the familiar, the bark of trees, the shape of branches, and yet boundless, extending into spaces that could only be conceived with imagination, reverence and patience. Yggdrasil's roots were said to sink into deep wells and hidden realms, each root reaching toward a different part of existence. One rooted itself in the land of the gods, Asgard, where the Aesir dwelled and the patterns of divine governance and wisdom took form. Another reached toward Jotunheim, the land of giants representing the untamed, chaotic forces that coexisted alongside human life. A third extended to Niflheim, a misty, icy world associated with primordial cold and mystery, where waters gathered in stillness and the cycles of decay and regeneration were quietly observed. From these roots, life and energy spread through the trunk and branches, intertwining realms that might otherwise seem separate. The world tree was not a static image, nor a symbol of dominance or hierarchy. It was a living, breathing metaphor for the interconnectivity of existence, for the threads of influence and consequence that ran between all forms of being. Above, the branches of Yggdrasil stretched into heights that touched the heavens, connecting realms not always visible to human eyes. There, in the uppermost spaces, were the domains of gods and celestial beings, where the motions of stars, sun and moon were contemplated and interpreted. It was in these heights that Odin, sitting upon Hildisgalf, could observe the 9 realms, understanding their unfolding in a way beyond ordinary perception. The branches also provided shelter and passage for creatures both mundane and magical. Eagles perched in the highest boughs, ravens flew between branches and worlds, and serpents or dragons wound along trunks and roots, embodying both the dangers and the continuity inherent in life. These images were not meant to frighten, rather they offered a quiet, reflective understanding that the world was vast, layered and sustained by forces that were observable in part, hidden in part, and always interdependent. Beneath Yggdrasil, the wells and springs were of great importance in the Norse imagination. The Well of Urther in particular was a place where the Norns, the weavers of fate, drew water to nourish the roots, ensuring the stability and continuity of the cosmos. Here, in the silent movements of water and the weaving of destiny, the early Norse found an image of life itself, patient, inevitable, and interconnected. One could imagine the long, quiet winters by the fjords, watching ice melt slowly in streams, and sensing in these small natural processes the larger patterns of order and chaos that Yggdrasil embodied. Through this vision, the Norse did not see the cosmos as random, but as an intricate system where all things from the lowliest stone to the most distant star were woven into a single enduring structure. Yggdrasil also carried symbolic weight for the human experience. Mortals too were part of these interconnections, their lives affected by actions in other realms, by choices of gods and giants, and by forces that were as subtle as a winter wind and as powerful as a storm-tossed sea. The tree represented a quiet reassurance that, despite unpredictability, there was structure and meaning underlying existence. Human beings in this conceptual framework were not insignificant. Their lives mattered as part of the larger weave. Each seed sown, each hunt undertaken, each observation of the changing seasons, mirrored the interconnected threads of Yggdrasil, linking mortal effort to the slow, inevitable unfolding of cosmic order. Throughout generations, this vision of Yggdrasil provided a foundation for myth and ritual. It was reflected in stories told around longhouse fires, in poems recited during the long winter nights, and in quiet meditations upon the natural world. By imagining a tree whose roots and branches connected all realms, the Norse cultivated a sense of place within the universe, recognizing the interdependence of life, death, divine action, and human endeavor. The tree's permanence and expansiveness offered a form of comfort and stability, a way to conceptualize chaos and order simultaneously, and a reminder that life, in all its forms, was interconnected and cyclical. Even as one considered the creatures that inhabited Yggdrasil, dragons, eagles, serpents, and more, there was no sense of alarm, only reflection. Each had a role, contributing to the balance and continuity of the world. The eagle perched atop the branches observed silently, The serpents and dragons moved with purpose along the roots, and the water in the wells beneath nourished the trunk and the realms above. This imagery created a contemplative understanding of life, that all forces, whether divine, mortal or natural, were part of a greater whole, functioning together in ways that were often subtle, unseen, and profoundly enduring. As the Norse imagined the branches stretching into the sky and the roots reaching deep into hidden waters, Yggdrasil became a lens for interpreting both immediate and cosmic phenomena. Seasons, storms, famines and blessings could be contextualized within this vision, connecting everyday experience with the vast, layered structure of the world. To contemplate Yggdrasil was to contemplate patience, balance, and the quiet endurance of life through cycles of change. The tree became not only a myth but a meditation, a nightly reflection for those who sat beside the hearth and watched the northern lights shimmer faintly in the winter sky, sensing the slow, persistent connections that linked all things from the smallest seed to the highest star. In this way, Yggdrasil was the heart of Norse cosmology, a living, dynamic image that tied together gods, humans, giants and spirits, offering a contemplative framework for understanding existence. It symbolized the quiet order underlying apparent chaos, the patient weaving of fate, and the unbroken connection between all forms of being. The early Norse, in observing their landscapes and lives, imagined the world not as a collection of disconnected events, but as a single interwoven tapestry, with Yggdrasil at its center, reaching quietly across time, space and consciousness. As the branches of Yggdrasil stretched skyward, reaching toward the infinite and the unseen, they cradled among their highest reaches a realm that was at once luminous, ordered, and quietly commanding, Asgard, the home of the Aesir gods. It was imagined not merely as a place, but as an idea, a domain where the principles of governance, wisdom, and cosmic balance were concentrated, and where the divine maintained the subtle equilibrium of the 9 realms. In this vision, the landscape of Asgard was not stark or chaotic, but deliberate, its grandeur neither ostentatious nor flamboyant, but emanating a sense of permanence and careful design, as if every hall, courtyard and pathway had grown into existence alongside the ideals it represented. Asgard, like Yggdrasil itself, was as much a meditation on the structure of existence as it was a mythic location, a way for the early Norse to conceptualize authority, order, and the quiet maintenance of the cosmos. At the center of this elevated realm stood the majestic halls of the Aesir, each constructed with a careful attention to proportion, light, and symbolic significance. These halls were imagined as open and airy, with high ceilings that allowed sunlight to filter through in patterns that shifted with the passing hours, illuminating carved pillars, tapestries, and the intricate designs that told stories of creation, of heroic deeds, and of divine wisdom. Within these halls the gods convened, not in haste or turmoil, but with the deliberate contemplative demeanor of beings who understood both the weight and the subtleties of their responsibilities. Meetings were governed by patience, observation, and reflection. Laws were not merely decreed but observed, contemplated, and integrated into the quiet functioning of existence. In this way, Asgard became both a tangible home and an abstract ideal, a place in which cosmic order and moral reflection coexisted seamlessly, a space where the divine could consider the intricacies of fate and the movement of the 9 worlds below. Among the many structures of Asgard, none was as central, as quietly commanding, as Yggdrasil, the high throne of Odin, positioned atop a peak that allowed him to see across the 9 realms. Odin's seat was not simply a place to sit, but a vantage point, a means of perceiving the full complexity of existence. From here he could observe events unfolding in Midgard, watch the movements of giants in Jotunheim, or note the subtle influences of the Vanir in their distant realm. Yggdrasil symbolized knowledge, contemplation, and the responsibility of perception. It was a reminder that governance, even among the divine, was not simply about command or action, but about seeing clearly, understanding deeply, and responding with measured thought. The imagery of Odin upon this throne conveyed a sense of quiet vigilance, a calm awareness that the threads of fate, woven by the Norns beneath Yggdrasil, were constantly interacting with the will and choices of gods and mortals alike. The environment of Asgard itself was imagined with care, reflecting the qualities of those who resided there. Pathways were lined with trees that never shed their leaves, providing gentle shade and a sense of eternal continuity. Streams ran clear and steady, reflecting the light of sun and stars, serving as reminders of clarity and reflection. Courtyards opened onto vistas of distant mountains, rolling clouds, and the subtle auroras that colored the northern skies. The realm was alive, not with loud noise or chaos, but with the quiet rhythms of observation, meditation, and the steady maintenance of order. Even the creatures of Asgard, the birds, the hounds, the occasional magical beast, were integrated into this order, serving as companions, observers, and symbols of various aspects of divine vigilance and interaction. The Aesir themselves were not static figures within these halls. Each embodied a principle, a quality that the early Norse recognized as essential for the maintenance of life, community, and cosmic balance. Odin, with his single watchful eye, represented wisdom, insight, and the capacity for sacrifice in pursuit of understanding. Thor, whose hammer Mjolnir symbolized protection and strength, was imagined moving among the halls and courtyards in measured steps, a stabilizing presence attuned to the protection of both gods and mortals. Other members of the Aesir, each with their own domains and responsibilities, contributed to a silent, harmonious governance that mirrored the patterns observed in nature, the consistency of seasonal cycles, the interplay of light and shadow, the quiet persistence of rivers and mountains. In Asgard, the principles of leadership and responsibility were not abstract concepts, but living, embodied presences, inseparable from the landscape and architecture of the realm itself. It is also important to consider the role of perspective within this vision. From the vantage of Hildegard, the 9 realms could be perceived not as distant, disconnected locations, but as integrated components of a single, overarching system. The gods' ability to observe and influence events was not meant to suggest omnipotence in a human sense, but a measured attentiveness, a slow, contemplative engagement with the world. This subtle governance reinforced the idea that the cosmos operated according to patterns that were both observable and mysterious, a blend of structure and fluidity. Asgard, in this way, functioned as both home and lens, a place where divine principles could be maintained and reflected upon, and from which the complexity of the wider world could be quietly appreciated. Through stories, oral traditions, and later written accounts, Asgard was preserved not only as a physical realm, but as a symbol of cosmic order, patience, and thoughtful stewardship. Longhouse fires in Midgard would echo with tales of the Aesir, of Odin consulting the Norns, of Thor preparing to protect the realms, and of subtle negotiations among gods to maintain balance. These stories served both to entertain and to guide, offering human listeners reflections on wisdom, responsibility, and the slow, enduring work of observation and care. Asgard was, therefore, both distant and intimate, distant in its placement among the branches of Yggdrasil, and intimate in its reflection of human ideals, aspirations, and the quiet pursuit of understanding within a world full of complexity and interconnectedness. In imagining Asgard in this way, the early Norse established a template not only for their gods but for their conceptualization of the universe itself. The realm was majestic, yet measured, powerful, yet contemplative, ordered, yet connected to the unpredictable movements of other worlds. It existed as a quiet center, a place of reflection and observation, from which the threads of life, fate, and natural law could be perceived and respected. Asgard, in all its deliberate splendor, offered a slow, steady meditation on the nature of governance, wisdom, and the interwoven fabric of existence, a model for both divine and human reflection that would resonate through stories, rituals, and imagination for generations to come. In the quiet expanses of Asgard, among the deliberate halls and gently swaying branches of Yggdrasil, Odin, the Allfather, held a presence that was both commanding and contemplative. Unlike the vivid bursts of energy represented by thunder and lightning, which Thor might summon, Odin's influence was subtle, pervasive, and reflective. He was a figure defined less by immediate action than by patience, observation, and the measured pursuit of understanding, embodying the quiet principles of knowledge, foresight, and the slow unfolding of insight. In early Norse imagination, Odin was not merely a god of power or war, but a figure who exemplified the human and divine pursuit of wisdom, the recognition that understanding the world, and one's place within it, often demanded sacrifice, reflection, and detachment from the immediate and the familiar. Odin's quest for knowledge was perhaps the most defining aspect of his character. Tales tell of his willingness to endure hardship, physical strain, and profound personal loss to gain insight into the workings of the cosmos. One of the most striking of these narratives describes Odin hanging from Yggdrasil, pierced by his own spear, suspended for 9 nights without nourishment or comfort. In this prolonged act, he sought to understand the runes, the symbolic language through which the forces of existence could be perceived and interpreted. The act was not one of bravado or spectacle, but a slow, deliberate engagement with the mysteries of life and the universe, a willingness to endure suffering in order to perceive patterns and truths otherwise hidden. The image of Odin, motionless yet attentive, suspended in the branches of the world tree, became a meditation on the nature of sacrifice, patience, and the quiet accumulation of knowledge over time. Odin's association with poetry and inspiration further illustrates his reflective nature. In Norse belief, poetry was more than artistic expression. It was a conduit for understanding, a means of preserving and transmitting the wisdom of gods and mortals alike. Odin's gift of poetry, often described as coming from his acquisition of the mead of inspiration, emphasized the subtle, contemplative ways in which knowledge could be shared and internalized. In the long winters of northern lands, when firelight flickered against the walls of longhouses, storytellers and skalds could trace their inspiration back to Odin's calm, deliberate pursuit of insight. Poetry was, in essence, a slow, reflective practice, a vehicle for meditation on human experience, divine action, and the quiet rhythms of the natural and spiritual worlds. Odin's presence in these stories reinforced the value of patience, observation, and careful thought, qualities essential not only for divine governance, but for human survival and understanding. War and strategy were also within Odin's domain, yet even here, his approach was measured rather than impulsive. Unlike the direct, forceful intervention of Thor, Odin's engagement with conflict emphasized foresight, planning, and the assessment of consequence. In myth, he often guided heroes and warriors, subtly influencing events to align with larger patterns of fate. This detached, contemplative approach underscored a key principle of Norse thought, that power alone was insufficient. Understanding, insight, and careful action were equally necessary. Odin's wisdom allowed him to perceive the interconnections between events, realms, and beings, ensuring that the outcomes of conflict and the flow of destiny were considered within the larger cosmic framework of Yggdrasil and the 9 worlds. Odin was also intimately connected with the spirits and the dead, a reflection of his role as a god of knowledge and perception. He could traverse the boundaries between the living and the deceased, understanding the stories, choices, and consequences that shaped existence. This aspect of his character reinforced the quiet, reflective nature of Norse belief, that life and death, past and present, were intertwined, and that insight often came from careful attention to all aspects of existence, not merely the visible or immediate. In his interactions with the dead, Odin exemplified the value of patience, observation, and detachment, quietly recording the outcomes of human actions and the unfolding of destiny. The visual imagination of Odin reflects the interplay of observation, detachment, and quiet authority, often depicted with a single perceptive eye, having sacrificed the other for wisdom. He embodied the principle of seeing deeply and understanding broadly. His robes, sometimes described as dark and flowing, suggested motion without haste, an awareness of presence without unnecessary intrusion. In the halls of Asgard, or the heights of Helidskilv, Odin's figure was both central and unassuming, commanding attention through deliberate reflective posture rather than dramatic gesture. Even when interacting with other gods or mortals, his engagement emphasized careful thought, foresight, and the subtle shaping of events rather than overt action. Odin's meditative qualities also extended to his relationships with knowledge itself, particularly the runes. These symbols, derived from Yggdrasil and the hidden patterns of the cosmos, required patience to understand and skill to interpret. Odin's acquisition of this knowledge, through suffering and observation, reinforced a central theme of Norse spirituality, that understanding, whether of fate, poetry, or cosmic order, demanded endurance, reflection, and a willingness to embrace discomfort for the sake of clarity. In contemplating the runes, The early Norse could perceive not merely tools for communication but windows into the structure and rhythms of the universe, each line and curve a subtle guide to insight, action and the unfolding of time. Finally, Odin's presence in Norse belief was a quiet reminder of the interconnectedness of all things, from the heights of Asgard, through the branches of Yggdrasil, and into the realms of mortals, giants and spirits. His gaze encompassed the slow, intricate interplay of life and fate. He was both observer and participant, a figure who embodied the principles of patience, wisdom, and measured intervention. To meditate on Odin was to meditate on the value of understanding, the necessity of reflection and the calm acceptance of the vast interconnected patterns that shape existence. In the northern forests and fjords, beneath the longhouse eaves and across frozen fields, the early Norse recognized in Odin not merely a deity, but a model for thoughtful presence within a complex, enduring, and often unpredictable world. Beneath the soaring branches of Yggdrasil and the lofty halls of Asgard, the gaze of Odin often extended toward the lands of Midgard, where humans dwelled amidst forests, rivers and plains that stretched under wide northern skies. It was in this realm of mortal endeavor and fragile life that Thor, the son of Odin, took his place as protector, guardian, and embodiment of natural power tempered by purpose. Unlike the reflective wisdom of his father, Thor's presence was immediate and perceptible, felt in the rumble of thunder across mountains, in the flash of lightning over frozen plains, and in the sudden gusts of wind that swept down fjords and valleys. These phenomena, which could unsettle or inspire fear, were interpreted through the lens of mythology as signs of Thor's vigilance, a constant reminder that the natural world, though wild and untamed, was watched over by a force committed to the preservation of balance and human safety. Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, was both a tool and a symbol, representing the god's ability to channel immense natural energy with precision and intent. In the quiet contemplation of early Norse communities, Mjolnir was more than a weapon. It was an emblem of protection, of the careful intervention necessary to maintain harmony amidst the unpredictability of life. When storms arose, the crash of thunder and the jagged light of lightning were not merely chaotic events, but manifestations of a deeper order. Thor, moving through the skies, wielding his hammer to shield mortals from the forces that could destroy or destabilize. Through this lens, natural phenomena were not impersonal. They were imbued with purpose, a reflection of the careful balance between power and responsibility, between force and restraint. Thor's stories, recounted beside the flickering fires of longhouses, often described him confronting giants and chaotic forces that threatened both gods and humans. Yet these narratives were rarely told with urgency or alarm. They were slow, measured and reflective, emphasizing the principles that underpinned Thor's actions. Each confrontation illustrated the careful exercise of strength, the judgment necessary to determine when intervention was required, and the persistence needed to ensure safety and continuity. Through these tales, the early Norse cultivated an understanding of the natural world as a complex system, one that demanded respect, observation, and deliberate action. In Thor's figure, they saw the embodiment of a guiding principle, that power, when combined with care and responsibility, could transform potential destruction into stability and protection. The symbolism of thunder and lightning, so central to Thor, extended beyond mere spectacle. These forces were slow to unfold in the imagination, rolling across skies with measured rhythm, revealing their presence gradually yet unmistakably. The early Norse, accustomed to the subtle shifts of the seasons, the quiet rise and fall of rivers, and the slow patterns of migration and growth, could perceive in thunder a lesson in patience and inevitability. It was both a signal and a reassurance, a reminder that even the most violent expressions of nature were part of a greater order, observed and moderated by divine guardianship. In this way, Thor's storms were not alarming but instructive, quiet demonstrations of the balance between raw energy and controlled influence, between chaos and the protection of life. Thor's interactions with humans, while less contemplative than Odin's, were equally significant in reflecting Norse values. In stories of his journeys to Midgard, he often engaged with mortals directly or indirectly, ensuring their protection from overwhelming forces, guiding their understanding of natural rhythms, and exemplifying courage and resilience. These engagements emphasize the relationship between the divine and the mortal, not distant or abstract, but immediate, perceptible and tangible. Humans, in observing Thor's actions in stories and in the manifestations of storms and seasonal change, could cultivate a quiet respect for both the power surrounding them and the vigilance that maintained balance in their world. The environments associated with Thor were varied yet consistently tied to the natural world's raw, untamed energy. Mountains, forests and seas served as stages for his presence, reflecting the god's intimate connection with the landscape and the forces within it. Fours echoed with the reverberations of distant thunder, the ocean's surface reflected lightning flashes, and valleys became conduits for wind and storm. In these settings, the presence of Thor was sensed as both a protective and an instructive force, teaching the Norse people to interpret, respect, and coexist with the vast energies that shaped their daily lives. The gods' stories, therefore, were inseparable from the world in which they were imagined. Landscapes, weather, and cosmic patterns blended into narratives that were at once practical, contemplative, and deeply intertwined with lived experience. Thor's role in mythology also highlighted the equilibrium between human agency and divine intervention. While mortals acted with care, courage, and skill, Thor's oversight and occasional direct engagement ensured that the larger currents of chaos did not overwhelm the fabric of existence. This duality, human effort guided by divine vigilance, was central to the Norse worldview, reflecting a philosophy in which life was both precarious and orderly, unpredictable yet guided by principles of balance, protection, and enduring vigilance. Through Thor, the early Norse learned that strength and resilience were not isolated qualities, but were most effective when harmonized with observation, timing, and responsibility, principles that echoed across both myth and daily life. In the quiet of the long northern nights, as snow lay heavy over forests and rivers shimmered under pale moonlight, stories of Thor's calm, deliberate protection would be recited beside the fires. The narrative unfolded slowly, drawing attention to the rhythm of storms, the measured force of the hammer, and the subtle influence of the god over natural and mortal worlds alike. Listeners would feel the presence of energy tempered by wisdom, of violence rendered purposeful, and of power exercised with patience. Thor, in these tales, became a figure of contemplative might, a reminder that even the most intense forces could be aligned with care, observation, and protective intent, quietly maintaining the balance upon which both mortal and divine life depended. In this way, Thor was not merely a god of thunder and war. He was a model of interaction with the world's violence, a guardian of the fragile balance between the human and the natural, the mortal and the divine. Through the storms of Midgard, the flash of lightning, and the measured swing of Mjolnir, he demonstrated the Norse understanding of nature's dual capacity for destruction and sustenance, revealing a cosmos in which vigilance, courage, and deliberate action were necessary for the quiet endurance of life. The presence of Thor, felt across the skies, in the mountains, and through the telling of stories, became a slow meditation on protection, power, and the careful navigation of the forces that shape existence. While Thor's presence was immediate and protective, and Odin's contemplative gaze stretched across realms, Loki existed in a more liminal space, a figure of ambiguity, subtle influence, and quiet unpredictability. In the minds of the early Norse, Loki was neither wholly good nor wholly malicious, but a reflection of the unforeseen, the trickster whose actions revealed the delicate balance between order and chaos. He moved along the edges of mythic narratives, shaping events in ways that were often surprising, yet never entirely disconnected from the larger cosmic order. In contemplating Loki, one begins to see a principle deeply rooted in Norse understanding of life, that unpredictability is inherent to existence, and that the unexpected, when observed attentively, can reveal truths about adaptation, resilience, and the quiet negotiation between forces both known and hidden. Loki's presence in Asgard, and among the other realms, was subtle yet pervasive. He was often imagined as shifting form, taking on the guise of animals, humans, or fantastical creatures, moving in ways that challenged the perceptions of gods and mortals alike. This shape-shifting was not mere whimsy. It symbolized the mutable, ever-changing aspects of life and the environment, the phenomena that could not be fully controlled or predicted. The early Norse observed such variability in the natural world, Sudden storms that appeared without warning, rivers that shifted course, animals behaving in unexpected patterns, or the arrival of strangers whose intentions were unknown. Loki's figure mirrored these realities, a mythic embodiment of forces that could disrupt, redirect, or illuminate, depending on perception and response. Although Loki was often associated with mischief and disruption, his actions were not entirely chaotic. Even in his most cunning exploits, there was a subtle order, a hidden purpose that revealed itself gradually. In many stories, the consequences of his schemes were double-edged, producing both difficulty and unforeseen benefit. Through this lens, the Norse could interpret challenges as opportunities for observation, learning, and adaptation. Loki's cleverness was a reminder that life rarely followed linear patterns, and that understanding required attention to nuance, timing, and the hidden interconnections between events. His role was not purely to deceive but to act as a catalyst, a subtle force prompting reflection, creativity, and the navigation of unforeseen circumstances. Loki's relationships with other gods were similarly complex. He was bound to the Aesir through friendship, kinship, and obligation, yet his presence frequently tested the boundaries of trust and order. Interactions with Odin, Thor, and other deities revealed not simple opposition but a quiet tension, the kind that arises when forces exist on the edges of perception and influence. These relationships were instructive in their subtlety, emphasizing that harmony often includes the accommodation of disruptive elements, and that understanding the consequences of actions requires both observation and patience. Loki's ambiguous nature was therefore not merely a narrative device, but a meditation on the balance of opposites, stability and instability, foresight and unpredictability, intention and accident. The environments in which Loki's influence was imagined were as varied as his character. He could appear in the shadowed forests, where the wind shifted unexpectedly by rivers whose currents were deceptively calm, or across the frozen plains, where the weather changed subtly yet decisively. Each setting reinforced the principle that life's outcomes were often shaped by variables beyond immediate perception. Loki's movements through these spaces were quiet, deliberate, and almost imperceptible, reflecting the way small changes can ripple outward to produce consequences far beyond their point of origin. In this sense, Loki embodied a slow, meditative recognition of the hidden patterns in both the natural and moral worlds, a lesson in attentiveness and adaptability. Even his more disruptive acts carried symbolic weight. For instance, Loki's involvement in the creation of magical items such as Thor's hammer Mjolnir or Odin's spear Gungnir illustrates the paradoxical nature of chaos. From unpredictability and cunning, beneficial outcomes could emerge. This principle aligned with the Norse understanding that the universe was neither entirely stable nor entirely chaotic, but a dynamic interplay of forces whose effects unfolded over time. Observing or contemplating Loki's influence encouraged reflection on patience, consequence, and the subtle artistry inherent in both mischief and creation. In essence, the trickster reminded mortals and gods alike that life's course was rarely linear, and that wisdom often lay in recognizing the interplay of chance, choice, and skill. In many stories, Loki's ultimate fate, his binding and confinement following the events leading to Ragnarök, serves as a meditation on the limits of disruption and the inevitability of cosmic cycles. Even in restraint, his presence continued to ripple across the nine realms, a reminder that unpredictability cannot be entirely eradicated, only observed, understood, and accommodated within a larger framework. His existence underscored the reflective principle that chaos, when contemplated and respected, is an essential counterbalance to order, providing insight into timing, consequence, and the endurance required to navigate life's shifting currents. The quiet influence of Loki also extended to human perception. In longhouses and villages, storytellers could illustrate the subtleties of deception, problem-solving, and the observation of hidden forces through tales of Loki's cunning. These narratives were slow, deliberate, and contemplative, emphasizing reflection rather than excitement. Listeners were encouraged to consider not only the immediate consequences of trickery, but the broader patterns of cause and effect, teaching attentiveness and adaptability as virtues necessary for navigating both the human and natural worlds. Loki's stories became a lens through which the unpredictable elements of life were examined, respected, and understood, cultivating a patient awareness of the fragile balance between stability and change. Through these meditative narratives, Loki emerged as a figure whose significance was not found in dramatic display, but in subtle influence and reflective disruption. He embodied the quiet, persistent presence of forces that could shift perspectives, test boundaries, and illuminate hidden structures within the universe. The Norse understood that to navigate existence successfully, one must remain observant, flexible, and attuned to nuance, qualities mirrored in Loki's ambiguous trickster nature. In contemplating him, the early Norse engaged in a slow, thoughtful recognition of life's inherent unpredictability, a gentle meditation on the necessity of balance, reflection, and adaptation in a world both ordered and unknowable. Above and below the branches of Yggdrasil, and in the quiet observation of Odin from Hilletsgelf, the 9 realms of Norse cosmology unfolded with a deliberate, measured complexity, each distinct yet subtly interconnected. The early Norse, in contemplating these realms, imagined not only physical spaces but qualities, atmospheres and principles that mirrored both the natural world and human experience. Each realm possessed its own character, its own rhythms, and its own lessons, and understanding them required patient attention, a willingness to observe, and a quiet acceptance of the variety inherent in existence. These realms were not always places one could visit in a conventional sense. They existed as reflective spaces in the mind, meditative landscapes in which the interwoven patterns of life, fate, and divinity could be perceived. Midgard, the realm of humans, was imagined as the central familiar plane, encircled and connected by Yggdrasil's immense roots and branches. It was a world of forests, rivers, mountains, and settlements, shaped by both natural forces and mortal endeavor. In Midgard, humans experienced the slow rhythms of the seasons, the cycles of planting and harvest, and the persistent influence of weather and geography on daily life. Here the divine presence was subtle, felt in the protections of Thor, the guidance of Odin, and the occasional interferences or lessons from other beings, such as Loki. Midgard was the tangible intersection of the material and the spiritual, a space where action and consequence were measured and observed with careful attention. Asgard, already explored in previous narratives, was both elevated and luminous, the domain of the Aesir, embodying principles of governance, observation, and cosmic oversight. Its vast halls, shaded courtyards, and serene streams provided a contemplative counterpoint to the mortal realm, emphasizing order, wisdom, and the quiet maintenance of balance. The connections between Asgard and the other realms were not merely symbolic but reflective of the interconnectedness inherent in all things, demonstrating that stability in one domain influenced the health and flow of the others. Vanaheim, the realm of the Vanir gods, was characterized by fertility, growth, and abundance. Unlike the sometimes austere and contemplative Asgard, Vanaheim was imagined with softer light, fertile lands and waters that nourished life. The Vanir embodied prosperity, harmony with nature, and the slow cultivation of both human and agricultural potential. In stories, Vanaheim emphasized the importance of patience, cooperation, and the quiet accumulation of resources, illustrating that stability and prosperity required time, care, and careful observation. Alfheim, the realm of the light elves, exuded an ethereal, luminous atmosphere. Light here was gentle and pervasive, filtering through forests, glinting on streams, and highlighting the delicate presence of beings associated with purity, beauty, and subtle influence. Alfheim represented the finer, reflective qualities of existence, perception, inspiration, and the subtle shaping of events through grace and attentiveness. The elves' existence underscored the importance of noticing small patterns, of observing interactions with patience, and of cultivating an awareness of the delicate balance between visible and invisible forces. Svartalfheim, by contrast, was the domain of the dwarves and dark elves, beings of craftsmanship, subterranean halls, and quiet labor. Deep beneath the surface, in tunnels and forges, life was slow, deliberate, and intricately patterned. Here, creation required skill, patience, and careful attention to detail. The Dark Elves' work with metals, runes and tools symbolized mastery over material and symbolic elements alike, demonstrating that persistence, subtlety, and skillful engagement with one's environment could transform raw materials into objects of enduring significance. Svartalfheim reminded the Norse of the slow, deliberate nature of both labor and wisdom, and the importance of careful observation in shaping the tangible and intangible. Jotunheim, the realm of giants, was vast, untamed, and imposing. Mountains rose abruptly, rivers carved unpredictable paths, and forests stretched without clear boundaries. Here the forces of nature were experienced in their rawest forms, reflecting strength, unpredictability, and persistence. In Jotunheim, the giants embodied principles both threatening and instructive, illustrating that life's challenges often arose from immense, uncontrollable forces. Yet these forces were not senseless. They revealed patterns, required respect, and demanded adaptation, teaching the value of endurance, observation, and measured interaction with powers beyond immediate control. Niflheim, the misty, icy world of primordial cold and death, held a quiet, reflective atmosphere. Frost-laden landscapes, still waters, and pervasive mists conveyed the inevitability of decay, the subtle movement of time, and the presence of unseen forces. Here, the dead and the spirits of forgotten things resided, a reminder that existence was cyclic, that life emerged from and returned to the stillness of the unknown. Niflheim encouraged contemplation, patient reflection, and acceptance of the slow, enduring processes of dissolution and renewal. Muspelheim, in contrast, was a realm of fire, heat, and elemental intensity. Flames, volcanic activity, and consuming light created a landscape both dangerous and transformative. Muspelheim embodied creative energy, destruction, and the latent potential of change. In this realm, the Norse recognized that energy, when channeled thoughtfully, could produce renewal and vitality, and that the same forces, if unmanaged, could consume and destroy. The interplay between Muspelheim and Niflheim, fire and ice, highlighted the balance necessary in understanding life's extremes and integrating them into a coherent perspective. Finally, Helheim, the domain of the dead governed by Hel, was neither fearsome nor chaotic in Norse imagination, but quiet, inevitable, and reflective. It represented the natural conclusion of mortal existence, the slow unfolding of life into stillness, and the maintenance of balance across all realms. In contemplating Helheim, the early Norse acknowledged mortality with measured acceptance, recognizing that life's processes were neither wholly joyful nor wholly tragic, but part of a larger, interconnected tapestry. Together, the 9 realms formed a slow, contemplative map of existence, each with its own atmosphere, creatures, and principles, yet all connected through Yggdrasil. The Norse, in observing and recounting these realms, cultivated patience, reflection, and a deep understanding of interdependence. Through this meditative exploration, the structure of life, death, chaos, and order could be perceived, guiding both mortals and gods in their quiet navigation of a vast, interconnected cosmos. Beyond the elevated halls of Asgard, and the vigilant protection of Thor in Midgard, and in the quieter, fertile spaces envisioned across the branches of Yggdrasil, the Vanir gods held a presence defined by growth, abundance, and the slow unfolding of life, in contrast to the Aesir, whose governance emphasized oversight, structure, and the deliberate maintenance of cosmic order. The Vanir embodied the rhythms of nature itself, the cyclical patterns of planting and harvest, the gentle rise and fall of rivers, the steady progress of seasons, and the quiet perpetuation of fertility across land, animals, and people. Their realm, Vanaheim, was imagined as softer in light, abundant in fertile plains and waters that nourished the growth of crops and the life of animals, a space where the quiet cycles of creation and renewal could be observed and contemplated without haste. In contemplating the Vanir, the early Norse recognized the intimate connection between life and environment, between human activity and the forces that nurtured it, and between the spiritual and the natural. The Vanir gods were not abstract or distant. They were intimately tied to the experiences of mortal communities. Frey and Freyja, 2 of the most prominent among them, were embodiments of fertility, prosperity, and relational harmony. Frey was associated with the growth of crops, the fecundity of animals, and the gentle regulation of natural abundance. In his presence the fields could be imagined as slowly, steadily thriving, and the cycles of sowing and harvesting were imbued with a sense of rhythm and continuity. Freyja, with her associations with love, beauty and fertility, reflected not only the physical reproduction of life, but also the subtle weaving of relationships, alliances, and the nurturing of social bonds. Together they exemplified the interdependence between natural cycles and human life, illustrating how prosperity and harmony were achieved through observation, patience, and respectful engagement with the rhythms of the world. The contrasts between the Vanir and the Aesir were striking yet complementary. While the Aesir's domain emphasized structure, judgment, and deliberate oversight, the Vanir reflected the quiet, persistent energies of life itself. The two groups were connected by both necessity and narrative. The Vanir's abundance could be disrupted without the stabilizing interventions of the Aesir, and conversely, the Aesir required the prosperity and fecundity nurtured by the Vanir to sustain their own power and the well-being of Midgard. This interdependence, slow and deliberate, mirrored the human experience of observing and interacting with the natural world. The seasons must be understood and respected, resources must be carefully stewarded, and patience was required to witness the unfolding of life's potential. The mythic relationships between these gods reinforced a contemplative recognition of balance, illustrating that harmony arose not from dominance, but from attentive engagement with all the forces at play. In visualizing the Vanir, the Norse imagined landscapes imbued with the quiet vitality of life. Rolling fields and gentle rivers reflected the rhythm of natural cycles. Forests shifted subtly with the changing seasons, and animals moved in patterns both predictable and subtly variable. The gods' influence was understood to flow through these spaces, guiding fertility and abundance without overtly imposing themselves. The experience of the Vanir was one of slow observation and integration. They encouraged mortals to notice patterns, to plant and harvest in accordance with natural cycles, to respect the rhythms that shaped the land, and to align their actions with the enduring currents of growth and renewal. Their presence suggested that prosperity, while desired, was neither immediate nor guaranteed. It required careful, attentive engagement with the environment and its subtle signs. The Vanir also embodied the reflective, almost meditative qualities of abundance and life. Just as water nourishes seeds, or sunlight gradually ripens fruit, their influence worked steadily and persistently, often unnoticed but profoundly shaping existence over time. This quiet effectiveness emphasized patience as a core principle, the understanding that the unfolding of life, the development of relationships and the growth of communities could not be forced or rushed. Through the Vanir, the Norse observed that the natural world was neither capricious nor indifferent but operated according to rhythms that, when respected, produced stability, nourishment, and flourishing. The slow contemplation of these cycles became a form of meditation, reinforcing attentiveness, endurance, and appreciation for the subtle energies that underpinned existence. The symbolic connections of the Vanir extended to human practices and daily life. Fertility rituals, agricultural observances, and acts of communal care reflected an understanding that the well-being of people was inseparable from the rhythms of the land and the benevolence of these gods. Offerings, prayers, and seasonal celebrations were quiet gestures of acknowledgement and alignment with these forces, acts that encouraged reflection on timing, reciprocity, and the enduring patterns that structured both natural and social life. The Vanir, in essence, provided a contemplative model. Prosperity and harmony were achieved not through domination, but through patient attention, care, and participation in ongoing cycles of growth, decay, and renewal. Even in tales of interaction with the Aesir, the Vanir's approach was measured and deliberate. The historicized myth of the Aesir-Vanir War, followed by the exchange of hostages and the blending of divine families, underscored the principle of cooperation emerging from initial conflict. Neither victory nor defeat was immediate. Resolution unfolded gradually, emphasizing understanding, negotiation, and the slow harmonization of divergent energies. In this narrative, the Vanir demonstrated the enduring value of patience, negotiation, and the recognition that long-term balance required attentiveness to relationships, resources, and natural cycles. Their divinity was expressed not in dramatic display, but in quiet, persistent alignment with the world and its rhythms. In reflecting on the Vanir, one recognizes that their presence within Norse cosmology offered both practical and philosophical insight. Life's interdependence between gods and humans, between fertile soil and thriving crops, between social bonds and natural abundance, was mirrored in their influence. The quiet cultivation of harmony, prosperity, and growth encouraged contemplation, slow observation, and measured action. In imagining these gods, the early Norse cultivated a deep awareness of the subtle forces shaping existence, understanding that attention, patience, and respectful engagement were essential to navigating the cycles of life, ensuring survival, and participating meaningfully in the enduring rhythms of the cosmos. Thus, the Vanir exemplified the integration of human and natural life, a reminder that divine influence, like the quiet progress of seasons, was persistent, observable, and interwoven with daily existence. Through their subtle, patient presence, the Norse learned to perceive life's interconnectedness, to respect the cycles that sustained it, and to recognize the quiet power of abundance, shaped by care, reflection, and attentive participation in the rhythms of the world. In this way, the Vanir became both a symbol and a lived practice, a slow meditation on life, nature, and the enduring interdependence that underlies all existence. Amid the fertile landscapes of Vanaheim, where rivers flowed quietly and fields shifted slowly with the seasons, Freyja moved with a presence that was at once luminous and quietly unsettling. She was a goddess of love and beauty, yet her influence extended beyond the pleasures and harmonies of affection into the profound and haunting dimensions of war, death, and the mystical arts. Her essence was multifaceted, reflecting the Norse understanding that life cycles encompassed both creation and dissolution, attraction and repulsion, intimacy and separation. In contemplating Freyja, one entered a reflective space, attuned to subtle energies, to the gentle yet inexorable patterns that shape existence, and to the interwoven threads of desire, mortality, and spiritual insight. Freyja's role in love and fertility was quietly pervasive, observed in the rhythms of human relationships, and the slow cultivation of beauty, affection, and connection. Unlike dramatic narratives of sudden passion or overt conquest, her influence was measured, enduring, and attuned to subtle shifts in emotion, circumstance, and social alignment. In the stories, she guided the formation of bonds, the careful nurturing of affection, and the patient unfolding of intimacy, emphasizing that connection was not immediate or purely physical, but a reflection of attentiveness, reciprocity, and the recognition of subtle signs within the world and within one another. Her presence in this domain suggested a slow, contemplative engagement with life's pleasures, an understanding that love, like the cycles of nature, required patience, reflection, and care to flourish. Yet Freyja's significance extended beyond the visible dimensions of love into the quieter, more somber spaces of mortality and war. She received half of those who fell in battle, guiding them to Folkvangar, her meadowed domain, while the other half went to Odin's Valhalla. This division reflected a contemplative awareness of duality, the coexistence of valor and vulnerability, life and death, human aspiration and divine oversight. In her guardianship of the fallen, Freyja's presence was both comforting and melancholic, a reminder of the inevitability of mortality, the slow passage of time, and the enduring consequences of human action. The Norse could meditate upon her role and perceive the quiet cycles of life and death, understanding that both were natural, necessary, and interwoven with the enduring patterns of existence. The mystical arts of Sida, with which Freyja was intimately associated, further deepened her presence as a figure of subtle power. Sida was a form of magic that involved foresight, influence, and manipulation of fate, requiring patience, focus, and careful attention to the unseen currents of the world. In practicing Sida, whether in mythic narrative or in the reflective imagination of the early Norse, one attuned to the rhythms of energy, the hidden interactions between beings, and the slow unfolding of events. Freyja, as the patron of this craft, embodied the quiet, disciplined engagement with forces beyond immediate perception, illustrating that mastery and understanding demanded observation. patience and sensitivity to the smallest changes in circumstance and intention. Freyja's connection to both love and death created a compelling tension in the mythic imagination. Her beauty and allure were not merely aesthetic, they were reflections of the subtle forces that shape desire, attraction and devotion. These forces were interwoven with mortality, for life's pleasures existed within a framework of impermanence, and every experience was imbued with the knowledge of eventual decline. In contemplating Freyja, the Norse engaged with this interdependence, recognizing that the slow, deliberate cultivation of connection, the attentiveness to emotion and circumstance, and the patient navigation of desire were mirrored by an awareness of life's fragility and the quiet inevitability of change. She became a meditation on the balance between pleasure and loss, attraction and impermanence, the tangible and the mystical. Her presence was also imagined in the spaces of the natural world, meadows gently touched by sunlight, rivers flowing quietly through fertile valleys, and twilight skies reflecting both beauty and shadow. In these settings, her influence was subtle and pervasive, shaping not only human experience, but also the perception of the environment itself. She exemplified the reflective awareness necessary to engage with both life's delights and its inevitable sorrows, teaching that careful observation, patience, and the acknowledgement of hidden forces were essential to navigating the world. Through Freyja, the Norse observed that love, beauty, and mortality were inseparable, interconnected, and quietly instructive in the cultivation of attentiveness and understanding. Freyja's role in war, as one who received the slain, further emphasized her calm yet haunting authority. Unlike the dramatic triumphs and chaotic battles depicted in other narratives, her stewardship was measured and deliberate. She did not merely command or control, she guided, observed and integrated, ensuring that the fallen were honored, their stories acknowledged, and their fates aligned with the larger cosmic order. This measured presence reflected the Norse appreciation for cycles of action and consequence, for the slow accumulation of insight, and for the contemplative recognition that life, death, and the mystical arts were part of a continuous interconnected web. In contemplating Freyja, the early Norse could reflect on the interplay of forces that shape existence: love and desire, mortality and valor, attraction and impermanence, knowledge and mystery. Her multifaceted presence encouraged a patient awareness of life's subtleties, a meditative engagement with the rhythms of human and natural cycles, and a quiet acknowledgement of the forces beyond immediate perception that guided fate. She embodied the principle that beauty, power, and insight were not separated from the inevitability of change, but were defined in relation to it, teaching that understanding, connection and contemplation were necessary to navigate the interconnected realms of gods and humans alike. Thus, Freyja emerged as a figure whose allure was at once comforting and haunting, luminous and shadowed, immediate and enduring. Her presence in Norse cosmology was a meditation on the delicate interweaving of love, death, and mystical insight, a slow reflection on the cycles that govern both mortal and divine life. In her quiet guidance, the early Norse could perceive the subtle interplay of forces, the measured unfolding of events, and the enduring need for observation, patience and attentiveness in navigating the worlds above, below, and between. Through her, the mysteries of desire, beauty, mortality, and magic were experienced not in sudden revelation, but in the slow, deliberate contemplation that shaped understanding, reflection, and the quiet endurance of life itself. Within the gentle expanses of Vanaheim, where the air carried the slow scent of ripening crops and the soft murmur of rivers threaded through fertile valleys, Frey held a presence defined by calm abundance and measured prosperity. Unlike the commanding oversight of the Aesir, or the unpredictable cunning of Loki, Frey's influence was quiet, sustaining, and woven into the natural rhythms of the world. He was the embodiment of fertility in its broadest sense, the growth of fields, the fecundity of animals, the balance of weather and water that allowed life to endure and flourish. In reflecting upon Freyja, the early Norse could perceive the slow cycles of nature as not merely physical phenomena, but as expressions of an enduring attentive force, one that required patience, observation, and respect. Freyja's role extended beyond mere agricultural prosperity. He was intimately tied to the unfolding of seasons, the timing of sowing and harvest, and the subtle interplay between light, warmth, and the fertility of the soil. In contemplating his presence, The Norse imagined the gradual transitions of the year, the thawing of snow in early spring, the elongation of daylight, the slow maturation of crops, and the eventual cooling and retreat of warmth in autumn and winter. Each phase was attended by Freyja, who guided these processes with quiet, deliberate care. His influence was pervasive yet unassuming, a reflection of the principle that abundance and continuity were the results of attentive participation and alignment with natural rhythms rather than sudden or forceful intervention. The landscapes associated with Freyja were imbued with subtle vitality. Rolling fields shimmered under soft sunlight, streams meandered with gentle purpose, and groves of trees shifted imperceptibly with the passage of time. In these spaces, his presence was both observable and meditative. The slow growth of grain, the steady increase in animal herds, and the gentle replenishment of rivers and soil all bore his quiet signature. Life in the Norse imagination, under the guidance of Freyja, was experienced as a continuum, where prosperity emerged gradually, cultivated through awareness, care, and patient alignment with environmental cycles. There was an implicit understanding that the natural world required both respect and participation. One did not merely receive abundance but attuned oneself to its rhythms. Freyja's influence also extended to human practice and community life. Rituals and observances marking planting, harvesting, and seasonal transitions were quiet affirmations of the interconnectedness of divine oversight, human effort, and natural processes. Offerings, prayers, and ceremonial acts were not dramatic gestures of devotion, but measured acknowledgments of interdependence, recognizing that fertility and prosperity were achieved through careful attention and alignment with enduring patterns. Through these practices, the early Norse cultivated a patient awareness of timing, consequence, and the necessity of participating thoughtfully in the cycles of life. In mythic narratives, Freyja's actions emphasized the enduring stability provided by measured influence rather than dramatic intervention. While he was occasionally involved in conflicts or disputes among gods, his role was fundamentally one of maintaining balance, ensuring that the forces of growth and decay remained in proportion, and that the rhythms of the natural world continued without disruption. This quiet stewardship reflected a philosophy in which life's continuity depended upon attentive, deliberate engagement rather than sudden exertion of power, an understanding mirrored in the cycles of agriculture, animal husbandry, and seasonal observances that structured human existence. Freyja's connection to prosperity was also philosophical, extending beyond material abundance into the broader principles of life sustainability and interdependence. The quiet growth of crops mirrored the patient nurturing of social and familial bonds, the careful stewardship of resources, and the attentiveness necessary to navigate life's subtle patterns. In contemplating Freyja, the Norse learned that balance and continuity were achieved through persistence, observation, and an ongoing reflective engagement with the world. Prosperity, in this context, was not a sudden reward, but the outcome of alignment with enduring principles, a meditation on patience, care, and the slow unfolding of potential. Even the changes of seasons, from the delicate emergence of spring to the fullness of summer, the waning of autumn, and the stillness of winter, were imbued with Freyja's presence. These transitions were neither abrupt nor chaotic. They moved with subtle rhythm, encouraging reflection and attentiveness. Through the quiet contemplation of seasonal cycles, one could perceive patterns of cause and effect, recognize the importance of timing in both natural and human affairs, and develop a meditative understanding of continuity and change. Freyja's influence was therefore as much philosophical as it was practical, fostering a deep appreciation for life's inherent cycles and the enduring balance that underpinned existence. In this way, Freyja represented the slow, sustaining forces of life, the quiet principles by which growth, prosperity, and interdependence were maintained. His presence encouraged attentiveness to subtle changes in the environment, patient engagement with recurring cycles, and recognition of the interconnectedness of human, natural, and divine realms. In the calm observation of fields, rivers, and forests, and in the reflective acknowledgement of seasonal rhythms, the early Norse could perceive his guiding hand, steady yet unobtrusive, shaping the unfolding of life with measured care and enduring consistency. Thus, Freyja's quiet, pervasive influence became a meditation on the principles of patience, balance, and continuity. The slow unfolding of fertility, The careful stewardship of resources, and the attentive alignment with the cycles of nature were mirrored in human practices and perception, reinforcing the understanding that prosperity was inseparable from observation, reflection, and participation in life's enduring rhythms. Through Freyja, the early Norse engaged with the world in a contemplative, measured way, cultivating awareness, resilience, and appreciation for the subtle, sustaining forces that shape existence across seasons, generations, and realms alike. In the quiet spaces of early Norse settlements, where the wind whispered through coniferous forests and the smoke from hearths drifted slowly into the sky, the presence of the divine was both intimate and measured. To the Vikings, the gods were not distant, abstract beings, but active participants in the rhythms of daily life, subtly influencing the fertility of the land, the abundance of harvests, the health of animals, and the fortunes of families and communities. Engaging with these forces required attentiveness, respect, and deliberate action, and it was through rituals, offerings, and ceremonies that mortals sought to align themselves with the quiet yet pervasive currents of divine favor. These acts were neither hurried nor ostentatious. They were patient, reflective practices, carried out with awareness of timing, seasonality, and the slow unfolding of consequences. At the heart of these practices were sacrifices, known in Old Norse as blots. These were not singular, dramatic events, but carefully orchestrated gestures of reverence, often coinciding with the turning of the seasons, the cycles of agriculture, or significant communal milestones. Livestock, such as cattle, pigs, and horses, might be offered to honor gods associated with fertility, prosperity, or protection. The act itself was deliberate, a careful, measured process conducted to maintain harmony between human communities and the forces governing the natural world. The ritual was accompanied by gestures of respect and acknowledgement, the silent observation of the god's power, the measured presentation of offerings, and the quiet awareness that life itself, its cycles, abundance, and continuity, depended upon attentive engagement with these unseen forces. Beyond animal sacrifices, the Vikings engaged in acts of offering through feasts, libations, and symbolic gifts. Grain, mead, and other provisions were shared in ritual contexts, placed on altars, or presented at sacred sites, bridging the human and divine through tangible expressions of gratitude and recognition. These offerings were not made hastily or without thought. They were imbued with an awareness of the interconnectedness of all things, the labor invested in producing the food, the care required to sustain livestock, the observance of seasonal rhythms, and the acknowledgement that the god's favor was entwined with the patience and diligence of human action. In these practices, a slow reflection upon cause and consequence was cultivated, emphasizing that devotion was inseparable from attentiveness to the natural world and communal well-being. Of ritual spaces themselves, groves, stone circles, and hearths within longhouses were chosen for their alignment with natural rhythms and the sensory qualities that invited contemplation. A grove might be selected for the stillness of its trees, the gentle flow of a nearby stream, or the soft play of sunlight and shadow, all of which created a meditative atmosphere conducive to reflection on divine presence. Inside longhouses, altars adorned with carved representations of gods or symbolic objects served as quiet reminders of interdependence, offering a steady visual and ritual anchor for daily devotions. Through these spaces, the Norse observed that human attention, environment, and spiritual practice were deeply intertwined, each influencing the others in subtle, enduring ways. Daily acts of devotion also reflected the principle of attentive, deliberate engagement. Offering a portion of food to the gods before a meal, maintaining altars, or reciting prayers and blessings were not merely superstitious routines, but slow, reflective acts that encouraged awareness of one's surroundings, one's labor, and one's relationship to the broader cycles of life. These small, repeated gestures reinforced a contemplative rhythm, that human well-being was dependent upon ongoing attentiveness to both natural and divine orders, that care taken in preparation and presentation could enhance alignment with the forces governing existence, and that mindfulness itself was a form of devotion. Certain festivals marked pivotal points in the agricultural and seasonal calendar, such as Yule, the winter solstice, and summer gatherings that corresponded with planting and harvest cycles. During these occasions, offerings and feasts were performed on a larger scale, weaving together entire communities in slow, deliberate acknowledgement of divine and natural rhythms. Songs, chants, and silent observation accompanied the sharing of food and drink, emphasizing reflection over spectacle, attention over excitement. The extended duration of these ceremonies allowed participants to enter a meditative state, observing the interconnectedness of their labor, their environment, and the forces that shaped the continuity of life, fostering a patient understanding of cause, effect, and the quiet influence of the gods. The choice of offerings and the attention to ritual detail reflected an understanding of reciprocity between human and divine. One gave carefully, with awareness of value and intention, knowing that the quality of attention and effort mirrored the respect due to the gods. Likewise, one observed the subtle signs of favor, the fertility of the land, the health of livestock, and the small yet enduring successes of community life. The Norse interpreted these signs slowly, patiently, as evidence of alignment or misalignment with natural and divine currents, cultivating a contemplative perspective in which the rhythm of action and consequence became a central principle of existence. Through these practices, the Vikings reinforced their understanding of life's interdependence. Humans were not isolated actors but participants in a vast interconnected web of forces, where attention, patience, and deliberate action maintained balance and fostered harmony. Rituals and offerings were both symbolic and practical, linking labor, observation, and spiritual engagement into a unified, slow-moving pattern that reflected the continuity of life across generations and the enduring influence of the divine in shaping mortal experience. In this quiet, measured devotion, the Norse found both guidance and reassurance, the understanding that existence was sustained not only by force or ambition, but by careful observation, attentiveness, and the patient cultivation of reciprocal relationships with the forces that shaped their world. Thus, rituals and offerings were more than ceremonies. They were meditative exercises in perception, alignment, and reflection. Through these acts, mortals attuned themselves to the rhythms of nature, the cycles of human life, and the enduring influence of the gods, cultivating a patient awareness that sustained both practical and spiritual life. The quiet attention given to offerings, the careful selection of ritual spaces, and the slow, reflective performance of ceremonies created a contemplative framework in which the interdependence of human action, environment, and divine favor could be fully perceived, appreciated, and integrated into daily existence. Amid the quiet observances of ritual and the deliberate offerings to the gods, the early Norse cultivated another subtle yet profound connection to the divine: the runes. These characters, etched with patience into wood, stone, or metal, were far more than instruments of communication. They carried with them a sacred resonance, a slow, meditative power that bridged the human and divine realms. Each rune was imbued with meaning that extended beyond its phonetic or linguistic function, encompassing principles of fate, natural forces, and cosmic order. In contemplating runes, one entered a reflective practice, a measured engagement with symbols that were at once practical, spiritual, and contemplative, providing a means of aligning thought, action, and understanding with the currents of the unseen world. The Norse perceived runes as gifts from the divine, primarily from Odin, who through his hanging upon Yggdrasil, acquired the knowledge and insight to interpret them. This mythic acquisition emphasized the deliberate, patient nature of their understanding. Wisdom and insight were not obtained instantaneously, but through sacrifice, observation, and careful reflection. By extension, humans approaching the runes engaged in a slow, mindful practice. Carving, inscribing, or tracing the symbols required concentration, precision, and attentiveness. In doing so, they were participating in a ritualized meditation, one that encouraged awareness of both the physical act and the deeper metaphysical significance embedded within each line, curve, and intersection. Each rune carried layered meanings, symbolic associations with natural forces, cosmic principles, and aspects of human life. For instance, the rune Fihu was associated with wealth and abundance, reflecting not just material prosperity, but the careful, patient cultivation of resources and relationships. Uruz symbolized strength and endurance, a slow, sustained force present in both the natural world and human endeavor. The Norse interpreted these symbols contemplatively, understanding that they were guides for reflection, instruction, and alignment rather than mere tools of communication. Their practice involved quiet observation, internalization, and measured application, reinforcing the patient engagement with life's subtleties that permeated Norse spirituality. Runes also served as instruments for divination, a practice requiring both calm attentiveness and thoughtful interpretation. Casting runes, observing their positions, and reflecting on their interrelations provided insights into potential outcomes, challenges, and opportunities. This slow, reflective interaction with symbolic forces cultivated a mindset of observation and patience, teaching that outcomes were rarely immediate or absolute, but evolved through careful consideration of interconnected factors. The use of runes in divination was not an exercise in control but in awareness, a measured engagement with fate, aligned with both natural and divine rhythms. In their physical form, runes often bore a quiet austerity, carved into wooden staves, stones, or weapons with precision and intent. Each inscription required attention to both shape and spacing, the hand moving deliberately to honor the significance embedded within the symbol. The process was contemplative, linking the physical act of creation with mental focus and spiritual awareness. Through this practice, the Norse reinforced the principle that meaningful action, whether in speech, writing, or ritual, demanded careful thought, patience, and alignment with enduring principles. Each rune, quietly etched, became a nexus of reflection, intention, and subtle power. Moreover, runes connected the individual not only to divine knowledge, but also to the broader continuity of culture, memory, and cosmology. They were carriers of ancestral wisdom, preserving stories, practices, and insights across generations. The slow, deliberate learning of runic symbols encouraged contemplation of history and continuity, reminding practitioners that human experience was linked to both natural and divine orders through time. In this way, the runes were simultaneously personal and communal, providing a meditative bridge between individual understanding and collective memory. The sacred significance of runes also extended to magical practice. Certain runes were incorporated into protective charms, amulets, or ritual objects, subtly influencing the environment and attuning the practitioner to spiritual forces. These applications were never hasty or casual, they demanded precision, care, and reflective attention to both intention and execution. The act of inscribing runes became a form of quiet meditation, a disciplined engagement with symbolic power that mirrored the slow, enduring rhythms observed in agriculture, seasonal cycles, and ritual offerings. Through runes, the Norse recognized that language itself could serve as a conduit to the divine. The careful shaping of symbols, the patient observation of their interrelationships, and the reflective use of their meanings encouraged a contemplative, meditative approach to both knowledge and life. They were tools for reflection as much as for communication, creating spaces in which humans could align thought, action, and intention with enduring cosmic principles. In their practice, runes exemplified the careful, deliberate attentiveness that characterized Norse engagement with the world, an awareness that subtlety, patience, and reflection were essential to understanding both mortal existence and the divine forces that shaped it. Thus, the runes became more than mere symbols. They were a slow, contemplative language of the gods, a bridge between the seen and unseen, the temporal and eternal, the human and the divine. In quiet reflection upon their forms, meanings, and applications, the Norse could cultivate an awareness of interdependence, subtle influence, and the patient unfolding of insight. Through runes, wisdom was encountered not in immediacy or spectacle, but in the deliberate observation, attentive practice, and reflective engagement that allowed humans to perceive, interpret, and harmonize with the enduring currents of life and the cosmos. Amid the divine halls of Asgard, the fertile meadows of Vanaheim, and the winding, reflective streams of Midgard, the Norse imagined a world populated not only by gods and humans, but also by beings whose forms and presences embodied forces both natural and cosmic, subtle yet immense in their implication. These mythic beasts were neither capricious monsters nor mere allegorical figures. They were quiet, inevitable presences whose existence maintained the balance of the cosmos, reflecting the enduring tension between order and chaos, creation and destruction. growth, and dissolution. Among the most prominent were Jörmungandr, the world serpent, Fenrir, the bound wolf whose strength challenged even the gods, and Sleipnir, Odin's eight-legged steed, whose presence enabled movement across realms and perception beyond ordinary sight. In contemplating these creatures, one entered a reflective meditation on inevitability, interdependence, and the patient unfolding of cosmic principles. Jörmungandr, coiled within the depths of Midgard's surrounding oceans, was imagined as a presence both threatening and necessary. Its immense body circled the world, containing its own force within the confines of the seas, illustrating the principle that certain tensions, though latent, sustained equilibrium. In the slow contemplative observation of this myth, the Norse could perceive the balance between containment and potential disruption, the quiet awareness that immense power existed, yet was restrained through natural and cosmic law. Jörmungandr embodied the principle of inevitability. The serpent's presence was enduring, patient and unyielding, a reminder that certain forces cannot be eliminated, but must be observed, respected, and integrated into understanding of the world's rhythms. Fenrir, the colossal wolf, offered another reflection on cosmic challenge and balance. Born of the giantess Angerboda and Loki, Fenrir's power was such that even the gods could not easily restrain it. Yet in this restraint lay careful deliberation, chains forged with patience and foresight, binding not through brute force alone, but through strategic measured understanding. Fenrir's eventual role in the events of Ragnarök symbolized the slow, inevitable unfolding of consequence, the measured approach to forces that could neither be ignored nor impulsively confronted. In contemplating Fenrir, the Norse reflected on the careful attention required to navigate potentially destructive energies, whether in the natural world, human affairs, or the cosmic order itself. The wolf's quiet threat was not immediate. It was attention held in balance, patiently awaiting its destined moment, illustrating the inevitability woven into existence. Sleipnir, Odin's eight-legged steed, contrasted with the latent dangers of Jörmungandr and Fenrir through its quiet facilitation of connection, movement, and perception. Capable of traversing realms and dimensions, Sleipnir embodied the subtle forces of communication, understanding, and traversal, linking the domains of gods, humans, and other beings. Its 8 legs symbolized stability and speed, the capacity to move steadily across space without disturbing the underlying order. In the meditative reflection upon Sleipnir, the Norse recognized the quiet, patient coordination required to observe, navigate, and harmonize with complex systems. The steed did not act abruptly or with brashness. It facilitated awareness, perception, and engagement across interconnected planes, emphasizing the contemplative understanding necessary to traverse life's subtle and intertwined currents. The mythic beasts, collectively, illustrated a principle of balance that was central to Norse cosmology. Each creature's presence, power, and restraint contributed to a slow, enduring equilibrium. The latent potential for chaos in Jörmungandr, the controlled threat of Fenrir, and the mediating presence of Sleipnir created a dynamic tension that was neither hasty nor uncontrolled. In observing these forces, one could perceive the quiet inevitability that shaped all existence, the recognition that power and danger existed within a measured framework, and that understanding, attentiveness, and patience were essential to maintaining alignment with the cosmic order. Life, like the interplay of these creatures, was neither chaotic nor static. It was a carefully balanced continuum requiring awareness and reflection. The symbolism extended beyond the abstract or mythic into reflective awareness of the natural world. Jörmungandra's encircling of the seas echoed the measured cycles of tides, currents, and the slow shaping of coastlines over time. Fenrir's bound power mirrored the restraint and latent tension present in storms, predators, and natural forces whose release could be sudden yet inevitable. Sleipnir's traversal across realms paralleled the movement of knowledge, experience, and perception through layered contexts, whether environmental, social, or spiritual. In these contemplations, the Norse cultivated a patient, meditative engagement with forces that were simultaneously vast and subtle, immediate and long-acting, teaching that observation, care, and reflective alignment were essential to sustaining equilibrium. Even the narrative surrounding the interactions of gods and these creatures emphasized slow unfolding, reflective consequences rather than impulsive action. Preparations, observations, and restrained engagement characterized the divine approach to these beings, illustrating that intervention required foresight, patience, and alignment with enduring principles. Each mythic encounter highlighted the necessity of careful attentiveness to timing, power, and relational dynamics, reinforcing the contemplative understanding that chaos and order were interdependent, that tension could be managed without disruption, and that the quiet inevitability of cosmic forces demanded measured respect. Through Jörmungandr Fenrir Sleipnir, the Norse imagination provided a framework for understanding the delicate interplay of forces in existence, the latent potential within restraint, the inevitability within tension, and the guidance available through measured facilitation. Observing these creatures encouraged reflection on both human and natural systems, emphasizing that continuity, balance, and resilience emerged from attentiveness, patient observation, and recognition of subtle, interwoven forces. The calm yet inevitable presence of these beasts became a meditative lens through which the Norse could contemplate the broader cosmos, integrating understanding, caution, and respect into daily and seasonal rhythms alike. Thus, the mythic beasts exemplified the quiet, deliberate patterns of cosmic balance, forces that were immense yet controlled, threatening yet instructive, distant yet intimately connected to the unfolding of life across realms. In their contemplation, humans could observe the patient alignment of tension and stability, the slow unfolding of inevitability, and the enduring interplay between creation, challenge, and continuity. Jörmungandr Fenrir Sleipnir, in their reflective and measured roles, illustrated the enduring principle that cosmic and natural balance is maintained not through haste or domination, but through attentiveness, patience, and careful integration of forces, a principle the early Norse experienced both in myth and in the rhythms of the world around them. Beyond the luminous halls of Asgard and the fertile plains of Vanaheim, near the roots of Yggdrasil where the great tree stretched downward into the unseen and eternal, lay the Well of Urther, a quiet, meditative place where the essence of fate itself was said to be preserved and observed. Around this well moved the Norns, three enigmatic figures whose presence was at once tranquil and inexorably decisive. Known as Urther Verðandine and Skuld, they represented the past, the present, and the future, weaving the slow, continuous tapestry of time in which gods, humans, and the wider cosmos were entangled. In contemplating the Norns, the early Norse engaged with an understanding of inevitability that was neither threatening nor abrupt but patient, reflective, and unyielding in its constancy. The Norns were imagined as quiet, deliberate beings, sitting or standing around the Well of Ur, their hands moving slowly through the threads of destiny. Each thread represented the unfolding of events, the lives of individuals, the fortunes of communities, and even the actions of gods. Yet, though they wove, they did not hurry. Their motions were measured, reflecting the patience of the cosmos itself. Life's patterns were not revealed in sudden flashes, but emerged gradually in ways that could be observed, contemplated, and interpreted over time. The Norns' weaving symbolized the interconnectedness of all things, the continuity of cause and effect, and the principle that each action, choice, and natural occurrence contributed to a broader, persistent design. The representation of the past, embodied memory, history, and the slow accumulation of experience. She reflected the enduring weight of what had come before, the quiet persistence of precedent, and the subtle shaping of the present by events that had already transpired. In the Norse imagination, this was not merely a record of events, but a living principle, a tangible influence that shaped perception, action, and expectation. The past was not separate from the present. It was actively woven into the ongoing flow of life, a steady, deliberate foundation upon which the present and future rested. The careful attention to history, lineage, and prior outcomes fostered a contemplative, reflective awareness in which humans could perceive patterns, anticipate potentialities, and recognize the slow consequences of their actions. Verðandi, representing the present, embodied immediacy tempered by patience. She was not hurried, nor was she inattentive. She observed and guided the unfolding of the current moment with quiet precision. The present was both fleeting and continuous, a living tension in which choice, perception, and circumstance intersected. By contemplating Verthandi, the Norse appreciated the necessity of attentiveness, of measured engagement with what was occurring, and of the awareness that the present was always an interface between the accumulated past and the emergent future. The careful observation of the now became a meditative exercise, emphasizing that conscious attention, reflection, and awareness were essential to navigating life's rhythms. Skuld, the embodiment of the future, was the most enigmatic of the three. She represented inevitability, the potentiality of what was yet to unfold, and the patient passage of time toward outcomes that could not be forced or accelerated. The future was neither hasty nor capricious. It moved according to principles of interconnectedness and the accumulation of preceding events. In reflecting upon Skuld, the Norse cultivated an awareness that certain forces were beyond immediate control, that outcomes would emerge in their own time, and that the measured recognition of inevitability was a form of wisdom. Patience and observation, rather than haste or anxiety, were the proper responses to the quiet, deliberate unfolding of fate. The Well of Urdr itself was imagined as a still, reflective body of water, over which the branches and roots of Yggdrasil stretched in calm, enduring arcs. Its surface mirrored the movements of the Norns, the threads of destiny, and the slow passage of time. In its quietude, observers might contemplate the balance of cause and effect, the continuity of cycles, and the subtle interplay of forces that governed both the mortal and divine realms. It was a space of reflection, where the inevitability of events could be seen not as a threat, but as a principle of order, a patient rhythm in which life and existence were guided by interconnected forces, moving in slow, measured harmony. The weaving of the Norns was not hasty. It required observation, reflection, and attentive action from those who sought to understand their guidance. Each thread intersected with countless others, demonstrating the interdependence of choices, actions, and natural processes. Humans in their daily lives could perceive these principles indirectly: the slow development of seasons, the gradual accumulation of skill or knowledge, the persistent influence of social and familial relationships. The Norns, through their patient and deliberate weaving, provided a metaphoric framework for understanding that life's outcomes were shaped by careful interaction with enduring patterns, rather than impulsive or immediate forces. In mythic narrative, the presence of the Norns underscored that both gods and mortals were subject to slow, inexorable principles. Even Odin, the All-Father and seeker of wisdom, respected their influence, recognizing that knowledge of fate required observation, patience, and measured insight. The Norns' work reflected the quiet rhythms of cosmic order, a reminder that existence was governed by interconnected patterns that unfolded over time, that change was gradual yet inevitable, and that understanding arose from reflective attention to both the present and the accumulated past. In this way, the Well of Urdr and the Norns' weaving became symbols of contemplative awareness, the patient observation of cause and effect, and the serene acceptance of inevitability. Thus, the Norns and the Well of Urdr exemplified the slow, enduring principles that shaped Norse cosmology. Fate was neither arbitrary nor abrupt. It was a measured, continuous weaving in which the past, present, and future were interdependent. In meditative contemplation of these figures and their quiet labor, the early Norse could cultivate patience, attentiveness, and reflective understanding. The inevitability of events, the interwoven nature of all actions, and the enduring rhythm of cosmic time became accessible, not through haste or force, but through observation, reflection, and alignment with the patient, persistent order represented by the Norns. In their quiet weaving, the very fabric of existence moved steadily, inexorably, and profoundly, offering a space for calm reflection upon the subtle, measured forces that shape life and the cosmos alike. In the contemplative imagination of the Norse, life was understood as a continuum, extending beyond the visible world into realms of quiet transition and measured reflection. Death was not abrupt or senseless, but a passage into spaces where the cycles of existence continued under the oversight of divine forces, where the deeds, choices, and conduct of life echoed through structured, ritualized experience. Among these realms, Valhalla, Folkvanger, and Hell represented distinct yet interwoven conceptions of the afterlife, each emphasizing the calm, deliberate unfolding of destiny and the serene order that followed mortal departure. In these places, the Norse explored continuity, honor, and the meditative alignment between mortal life and cosmic principles. Valhalla, the great hall of Odin, was a space of measured grandeur and reflective solemnity, where those who had fallen in battle, chosen by the Valkyries, entered a liminal existence between life and the perpetuation of cosmic balance. Here, warriors did not merely revel in martial glory, they participated in the rhythmic and reflective exercises of preparation, combat training, and ritualized observation, each action maintaining a continuity of order and readiness. The Golden Hall, with its high ceilings, orderly arrangement, and steady routines, exemplified a careful balance between recognition of past valor and preparation for future cosmic challenges. Death, in this conception, was not a termination, but a transition into structured engagement with principles that transcended immediate mortal concerns, a continuation of attentive practice in alignment with enduring cosmic rhythms. Parallel to Valhalla, Folkvanger, the domain of Freyja, offered another perspective on the afterlife, emphasizing equilibrium, fertility, and reflection upon relational and natural connections. Chosen among those who fell in battle, or perhaps through quieter forms of life's contribution, individuals in Folkvanger experienced a calm meditative existence, often envisioned in groves, meadows, and softly flowing streams. These spaces allowed reflection on the subtle interplay between effort, consequence, and the sustaining forces of nature. The Norse imagined Folkvanger not as a place of transient excitement, but as a steady, enduring environment, in which the principles of growth, care, and attention were preserved beyond mortal life. Here, the rhythm of seasons, the movement of light and shadow, and the measured sounds of life in quiet observation continued to mirror the attentiveness that had defined living practice. Hell, in contrast, represented a domain of measured detachment, the final resting place for those who did not die in battle. It was neither chaotic nor punitive. Rather, it was an orderly and reflective space where the slow, inevitable passage of time permitted contemplation and the integration of life's experiences. Its imagery, often associated with cold, still landscapes, gently flowing waters, and silent expanses, conveyed a calm inevitability. In Hell, the dead engaged with the subtle continuity of existence, observing cycles that persisted beyond the immediate and tangible, reflecting upon the interconnectedness of actions, consequences, and cosmic patterns. The transition into Hell exemplified the Norse understanding that death was not abrupt disorder, but a measured, inevitable unfolding, a quiet integration into broader principles of balance and continuity. The journey into the afterlife was marked by ritualized acts that prepared both the living and the departed for passage. Funerary rites, including the careful placement of goods, symbolic gestures of respect, and quiet recitations, reflected the contemplative approach to mortality. Ship burials, cremations, and interments within natural settings reinforced the perception that death was intertwined with the cycles of nature, with human labor, and with the measured guidance of divine forces. Through these practices, the Norse cultivated awareness that the transition from life to death was neither chaotic nor disconnected, but an extension of the ongoing rhythm that linked existence across realms, seasons, and generations. In these contemplations, the afterlife became a space for reflection upon the integration of mortal experience with cosmic order. Warriors in Valhalla maintained readiness and alignment with the principles of vigilance, courage, and foresight. Inhabitants of Folkvanger engaged in quiet reflection upon relational and natural interdependence, and those in Hell participated in meditative acknowledgement of life's impermanence and the enduring cycles of continuity. Death, therefore, was not a final disruption but a passage into structured, attentive experience, emphasizing observation, patience, and integration with forces both subtle and immense. The calm, measured conception of afterlife spaces reinforced broader Norse principles that existence was sustained by careful engagement with natural, social, and divine forces, that transitions, whether seasonal, personal, or cosmic, required attentiveness and reflective participation, and that life's continuity even beyond death was preserved through deliberate alignment with enduring rhythms. In contemplating Valhalla, Folkvanger, and Hell, the Norse cultivated an understanding of mortality that was serene, contemplative, and integrated, observing inevitability without fear, recognizing continuity without haste, and embracing the patient unfolding of existence beyond the visible world. Thus, The afterlife in Norse belief was not a place of abrupt separation or unmediated judgment, but a set of measured reflective environments in which the principles of continuity, attention, and alignment with cosmic balance were preserved. Through ritual contemplation and recognition of these spaces, the Norse engaged with death not as an end, but as a continuation of ordered existence, where the same quiet, deliberate attention applied in life persisted, shaping the unfolding of consciousness, understanding, and integration across mortal and divine realms alike. Among the intricate threads of Norse cosmology, one of the most profound contemplations concerned the slow, inevitable unfolding of cosmic transformation, known as Ragnarök. This event, often imagined as the twilight of the gods, was neither sudden nor chaotic in its perception. It was a distant, gradual process, a sequence of interconnected events that reflected the cyclical rhythms of existence, the continuity of natural order, and the patient unfolding of time. Unlike depictions of sudden catastrophe or unbridled destruction, the Norse envisioned Ragnarök as a meditation on change and renewal, a deliberate progression in which endings were inseparable from beginnings, and death was a precursor to measured rebirth. The signs of Ragnarök were observed gradually, with subtle indications across the realms rather than abrupt manifestations. The slow weakening of cosmic structures, the shifting behavior of the natural world, and the deliberate fulfillment of prophecies were understood as components of an inevitable sequence. This perspective encouraged reflection on the long-term consequences of action, the persistence of cause and effect, and the quiet, patient rhythms by which life, nature, and divinity maintained balance. The Norse saw these processes, not with alarm, but with contemplative understanding, perceiving the progression toward transformation as an inherent principle of continuity, a necessary evolution of the universe that mirrored the measured cycles of seasons, tides, and celestial motion. Central to the understanding of Ragnarök was the recognition of its duality. It was at once a conclusion and a renewal. The fall of gods, the shifting of realms, and the dissolution of structures were part of an inevitable reset, clearing the way for regeneration and the emergence of new life. The imagery of fire, water, and other transformative forces in these narratives symbolized not arbitrary destruction, but measured, elemental change, the slow and inevitable process by which one state of being transitioned into another. In this way, Ragnarök exemplified the Norse conception of the universe as a continuum, where cycles of birth, death, and rebirth were inseparable, and where patience, reflection, and acceptance of natural inevitability were central to understanding existence. The roles of divine and mythic beings in Ragnarök were similarly conceived with calm inevitability. Gods, giants, and mythic beasts did not act with frantic haste or fear. They moved within their destined paths, engaging in events that had been foreseen yet required patient unfolding. Odin, Thor, Loki, and other entities approached these sequences with awareness of their predetermined nature, reflecting a contemplative engagement with the principles of cause, consequence, and cosmic timing. Even confrontations and transformations were not sudden shocks but carefully positioned elements within the broader tapestry of interconnected events, each contributing to the measured rhythm of transition and renewal. The aftermath of Ragnarök, in turn, was envisioned as a serene re-establishment of order, a world that emerged from dissolution with continuity intact, and life renewed in measured, thoughtful fashion. The survivors, gods, humans, and select creatures would inhabit a transformed landscape, one reshaped yet harmonious, in which the lessons and patterns of the past persisted in quiet guidance. Rivers flowed steadily, forests grew anew, and the cycles of day, night, and seasons continued, illustrating that endings were inseparable from ongoing, reflective processes of creation and adaptation. In this vision, death and transformation were neither alarming nor abrupt. They were aspects of a persistent, measured continuity that emphasized attention, patience, and integration into the broader order of the cosmos. The contemplative approach to Ragnarök also underscored the Norse understanding of temporality and human engagement with life's impermanence. By recognizing that all structures, beings, and circumstances were subject to eventual transformation, mortals were encouraged to observe patiently, act thoughtfully, and maintain alignment with enduring principles. Actions taken in life, attention devoted to relationships, and care for the environment were understood as contributions to the continuity of cycles, a measured investment that would persist through the eventual renewal inherent in Ragnarök. This perspective cultivated calm reflection, a meditative awareness of impermanence, and the understanding that endings were not to be feared, but observed as part of life's continuous unfolding. The symbolic imagery associated with Ragnarök, the rising of oceans, the slow encroachment of fire, the measured movements of mythic beasts, and the deliberate conflicts among gods, was contemplative rather than sensational. Each element served as a visual and conceptual guide for reflecting on inevitability, transformation, and the interdependence of forces. Observers were invited to perceive patterns, recognize continuity, and appreciate the measured unfolding of events as a principle of cosmic harmony. This slow, reflective interpretation encouraged the Norse to cultivate patience and understanding, seeing both the natural and divine realms as operating within a rhythm that was enduring, inevitable, and instructive. Thus, Ragnarök, in its distant, inevitable unfolding, exemplified the Norse conception of cycles, transformation, and renewal. It was neither a sudden catastrophe nor a source of unrestrained fear, but a patient process, a deliberate sequence that reflected the principles of continuity and balance inherent in the cosmos. Through meditative contemplation of these events, the Norse could integrate understanding of mortality, change, and the persistent flow of life into daily practice, fostering awareness, patience, and alignment with the enduring rhythms of existence. In this calm and reflective light, Ragnarök was less an end than a transition, a quiet transformation that mirrored the cycles of nature, the continuity of cosmic order, and the serene inevitability of life itself. Within the vast and reflective landscape of Norse mythology, attention was often given not only to gods and cosmic forces, but also to heroes and semi-divine beings whose existence quietly bridged the mortal and divine realms. These figures were neither omnipotent nor flawless. They were beings whose endurance, moral complexity, and reflective engagement with life exemplified the subtleties of human and divine interaction. Their stories were not told as dramatic spectacles of triumph or conquest, but as slow, deliberate narratives of perseverance, choice, and integration within the overarching patterns of the cosmos. In contemplating these figures, the Norse explored the patient unfolding of character, the consequences of actions over time, and the quiet balance between strength and limitation. Among the heroes, one often encounters individuals whose lineage or favor linked them to divine influence. Semi-divine figures, born of gods and humans, inhabited a liminal space where the extraordinary met the ordinary. Their abilities, whether in strength, perception, or subtle insight, were exercised within measured constraints, emphasizing the reflective approach to power and consequence that pervaded Norse thought. Unlike the gods, whose perception extended across realms and epochs, heroes engaged directly with the contingencies of mortal life, yet their integration into the larger cosmic narrative was seamless, as if their struggles, choices, and endurance formed threads woven into the broader tapestry of destiny, subtly affecting outcomes and reinforcing the persistent rhythms of cause and effect. The quiet perseverance of these figures was evident in the slow, deliberate manner in which they approached challenges. They did not act impulsively, rather they observed, reflected, and acted in alignment with circumstance and principle. Even when facing monstrous beings, environmental trials, or the inevitable decline of time, their engagement was measured, emphasizing sustained effort, moral deliberation, and attentiveness to both immediate and long-term consequences. In this, the heroes reflected a central Norse principle, that action, when guided by observation, patience, and reflective understanding, contributed to enduring order, even amidst tension, uncertainty, or the inevitability of mortality. Moral ambiguity also characterized these figures, reinforcing the contemplative nature of their narratives. Decisions were rarely clear-cut. Heroes often navigated spaces where right and wrong were intertwined, where choices had ripple effects across multiple layers of existence, and where outcomes could not be fully controlled or anticipated. This ambiguity emphasized reflection over impulsiveness, observation over judgment, and integration over unilateral action. In following these semi-divine paths, The Norse cultivated awareness of complexity, the subtle consequences of actions, and the measured understanding that even extraordinary beings were bound by broader patterns of causality and fate. Interactions with gods further illustrated the reflective rhythm of Norse cosmology. Heroes were neither passive recipients of divine will, nor entirely independent actors. They occupied a liminal space in which guidance, favor and challenge flowed gradually from the divine, mediated by circumstance, observation and action. Gifts, warnings and interventions from the gods were subtle, often contingent on patience, attentiveness, or moral deliberation. In turn, heroes responded with measured effort, reflecting, interpreting, and aligning themselves with larger patterns, illustrating the contemplative interaction between mortal endeavor and divine orchestration. Each action contributed to the unfolding of destiny, reinforcing the interconnectedness of beings and forces across realms. The mythic cycles in which these heroes operated often emphasized long-term consequences, rather than immediate reward or recognition. Battles, journeys, and quests unfolded gradually, punctuated by reflection, endurance, and quiet achievement. The narrative tempo mirrored the rhythm of seasons, the progression of natural cycles, and the slow accumulation of skill, wisdom, and understanding. Success was measured not only in victory, but in alignment with enduring principles, reflection upon consequences, and the maintenance of continuity within the interwoven structures of fate. This perspective cultivated patience, observation, and meditative engagement with life's unfolding. Even their legendary deeds, while notable, were integrated into broader cosmic patterns, rather than isolated spectacles. Slaying a monstrous adversary, recovering a lost artifact, or surviving trials did not simply elevate the hero in isolation. It reverberated through the network of relationships, social structures, and cosmic rhythms. Each act was an exercise in balance, reflecting interdependence, enduring consequence, and the quiet awareness that personal courage or skill was meaningful only within the context of larger patterns. The hero's path was thus a study in subtle alignment, careful engagement, and patient navigation of complexity. Semi-divine beings and heroes also exemplified the contemplative engagement with mortality. They observed the inevitability of aging, decline, and eventual death, reflecting on their actions and legacy with awareness of impermanence. Their perseverance, moral consideration, and integration with the cosmos illustrated that heroism was not defined by instantaneous success or immortal renown, but by sustained attention, measured action, and reflective engagement with the rhythms of life. In this, their narratives offered a meditative mirror for human reflection, the understanding that thoughtful participation, patient endurance, and moral attentiveness were essential to navigating the interplay between human existence and divine orchestration. Thus, the quiet lives of heroes and semi-divine beings illustrated a central Norse principle. Existence was a continuum of interconnected forces, in which action, reflection, and endurance were more significant than immediate glory or spectacle. Through patient perseverance, moral reflection, and integration into the cosmic order, these figures provided examples of measured engagement with life's challenges, subtle navigation of moral ambiguity, and alignment with enduring patterns. Their narratives, slow and contemplative, offered a framework for understanding human potential within a cosmos governed by inevitable cycles, interconnected forces, and the quiet guidance of the divine. In the lives of the Norse, mythology was not confined to the lofty halls of Asgard, or the abstract spaces of cosmic contemplation. It pervaded the slow, deliberate rhythms of daily existence, shaping routines, labor, and perception with a quiet but pervasive influence. The myths of gods, heroes, and cosmic cycles were integrated seamlessly into the mundane activities of farming, seafaring, domestic tasks, and seasonal observances, creating a landscape in which spirituality and daily life were inseparable. Each moment, whether planting a seed, hauling nets from the sea, or tending the hearth, was framed within an understanding of interconnectedness, divine guidance, and the patient unfolding of cause and consequence. Agriculture, for instance, was suffused with reflection on divine cycles and natural rhythms. The planting of crops, the tending of animals, and the timing of harvest were all measured with reference to the seasonal patterns attributed to deities such as Freyja and the Vanir, whose oversight of fertility, growth, and prosperity was quietly acknowledged through ritualized observances and offerings. A farmer might leave small tokens at the edge of a field, recite prayers or blessings, or observe omens in the weather, or the behavior of animals, all as part of an attentive engagement with forces both visible and unseen. These practices were neither hurried nor performative. They were slow, deliberate acts of integration, reflecting patience, observation, and an awareness that human effort was intertwined with divine favor and the subtle continuity of natural processes. Seafaring, a defining aspect of Norse life, similarly reflected the interplay of myth and daily routine. Mariners, whether on long voyages or local fishing expeditions, maintained a steady attention to winds, tides, and celestial markers, perceiving them as manifestations of divine forces or as signs from gods such as Njord and Thor. Rituals before departure, blessings, offerings, or quiet contemplation at the ship's prow acknowledged the potential dangers of the sea, while integrating respect for its rhythms into practice. The act of navigating through storms, currents, and shifting skies became a meditation on balance, patience, and alignment with forces larger than oneself. Mythology thus provided both interpretive guidance and contemplative structure, transforming routine labor into reflective engagement with the cosmos. Within the domestic sphere, mythology similarly guided quiet, recurring activities. Hearths, the center of household life, were sites of daily acknowledgement of divine presence, where offerings or small rituals were performed in honor of protective deities or ancestral spirits. Tasks such as baking, weaving, or crafting were not only practical but also infused with symbolic meaning, reflecting an understanding that the material and spiritual realms were deeply interconnected. Even routine observations of the weather, the growth of plants, or the behavior of livestock were interpreted through the lens of myth, cultivating attentiveness, patience, and reflective understanding. Daily life became a continuous meditation, in which every action, no matter how small, was aligned with broader principles of continuity and interdependence. Festivals and seasonal observances further illustrated the integration of myth into everyday life. Celebrations marked the solstices, equinoxes, and key agricultural milestones, combining communal gathering with reflective recognition of divine cycles and natural order. These events were neither hasty nor chaotic. They were measured occasions in which the rhythm of social, environmental, and spiritual life converged. Rituals, storytelling, and quiet acknowledgement of the gods' influence allowed communities to participate collectively in the slow, enduring processes of balance, renewal, and continuity. In these gatherings, ordinary existence and mythic principle were woven together seamlessly, creating a contemplative rhythm that guided both action and perception. Even in the observation of omens, natural phenomena, and subtle signs, daily life was informed by mythic understanding. Thunderstorms, eclipses, the migration of birds, and other recurring events were not interpreted solely as random occurrences but as reflections of divine will or cosmic patterns, requiring patient observation and careful reflection. By attending to these phenomena in a calm, measured manner, the Norse cultivated awareness of interconnectedness, the inevitability of natural cycles, and the subtle lessons embedded in the ordinary flow of time. Mythology in this sense was not dramatic or sensational. It was a lens for contemplative perception, integrating spirituality into the continuous quiet rhythms of life. Thus, the influence of mythology on daily life created an enduring reflective environment in which human actions were carefully measured against patterns of divine, natural, and cosmic order. Farming, seafaring, domestic routines, and seasonal observances became occasions for contemplative practice, attention to cause and effect, and alignment with enduring rhythms. The gods, heroes, and mythic beings were not distant or abstract. They were present in the slow, deliberate acts of everyday life, shaping perception, guiding practice, and reinforcing the quiet, persistent interconnectedness of existence. In this way, the Norse experienced a world in which the spiritual and the mundane were inseparable, each informing the other in a continuous, patient flow that sustained awareness, reflection, and harmony across the cycles of life. In the quiet spaces of Norse daily life, where labor, domestic routines and seasonal observances moved at a deliberate, unhurried pace. One of the most subtle yet enduring threads connecting generations was the oral tradition, preserved through songs, poetry, and carefully recited sagas. Skaldic poetry, Eddic verse, and narrative storytelling were not merely entertainment. They were meditative, reflective practices that carried myth, history, and moral understanding through time. Each recitation was a measured act of attention, a slow weaving of sound, memory, and meaning, creating continuity between past, present, and future, and fostering patient engagement with the rhythms of existence. The act of storytelling itself was conducted in a rhythmical and contemplative manner. Skalds, the poets and reciters of Norse tradition, would articulate each line with care, emphasizing cadence, alliteration, and the subtle interplay of syllables. This deliberate articulation was not for performance in a modern sense of spectacle, but as a measured exercise in preserving memory and ensuring the careful transmission of knowledge across generations. Every verse, every phrase carried layers of significance, accounts of gods' heroic deeds, the slow unfolding of cosmic events, and the quiet principles of morality and balance. Through attentive listening, participants absorbed not only narrative content, but also the reflective principles embedded in phrasing, repetition, and cadence. The sagas, long narrative poems or prose accounts, were similarly slow, immersive experiences. They traced the lives of gods, heroes, and ordinary people across landscapes and generations, emphasizing the gradual unfolding of events, rather than sudden or sensational action. In recounting genealogies, travels, conflicts, and reconciliations, the narrators encouraged careful contemplation, patience, and observation. The pace of recitation mirrored natural rhythms, like the slow growth of crops, the measured passage of seasons, or the steady movement of tides, reminding listeners that life and fate unfolded gradually, with each moment contributing to the continuity of the whole. In this way, the sagas functioned as meditative exercises, guiding communities in reflection upon their past, their moral framework, and their relationship with the divine and natural worlds. Oral transmission also reinforced attentive listening and communal memory. Knowledge, myth, and moral reflection were preserved not in written form, but in the disciplined practice of careful listening, repetition, and reflection. Listeners were active participants, internalizing rhythm, narrative, and significance, and gradually passing these stories onward with the same deliberate care. The practice cultivated patience and mindfulness, connecting generations in a slow, reflective continuum. Each story became a living thread within the fabric of cultural memory, sustaining an understanding of cosmic order, human action, and the quiet principles that guided both daily life and long-term destiny. Songs and poems often contained layered symbolism, requiring attentive contemplation to appreciate fully. References to gods, mythic events, and natural phenomena were not always explicit. Metaphor and allegory encouraged reflection on the interconnectedness of existence, the consequences of actions, and the enduring patterns of life and nature. By engaging with these subtle narratives, the Norse could cultivate awareness, integrate past lessons, and maintain alignment with cosmic principles. The oral tradition thus functioned as a reflective tool, a way to meditate on the slow currents of fate, the inevitability of cycles, and the patient observation of moral and natural order. The process of recitation itself was slow and deliberate. Each verse was pronounced with intention, pauses were meaningful, and repetition served both memory and reflection. Unlike hurried storytelling, this method allowed listeners to inhabit the temporal space of the story, absorbing its rhythm, texture, and depth. The repetition of key phrases, the echo of alliteration, and the measured structure of skaldic forms mirrored the reflective observation that characterized other aspects of Norse life, such as farming, seafaring, or domestic ritual. In this way, the oral tradition reinforced a contemplative engagement with existence, encouraging both narrator and audience to recognize patterns, anticipate consequences, and integrate observation into ongoing experience. Through these slow, attentive practices, mythology was preserved not only as narrative content, but as lived reflection. The songs, poems, and sagas maintained continuity between past and present, guided moral and practical understanding, and provided a rhythmic framework for observing the interconnectedness of life. In a world without instantaneous communication, the oral tradition ensured that knowledge, cultural values, and mythic understanding endured across generations, transmitted through patient practice, attentive engagement, and meditative repetition. Each performance became an immersive experience, gently shaping perception, memory, and understanding, and offering both narrator and listener a quiet pathway into reflection upon the cycles of life, death, and cosmic order. Thus, the songs, poetry, and oral tradition of the Norse were not merely cultural artifacts, but integral components of contemplative life. Through careful recitation and attentive listening, myths, heroic narratives, and moral principles were transmitted with patience, precision, and reflective depth. The slow unfolding of each story, like the deliberate movement of seasons or the gentle rhythms of work and domestic life, fostered continuity, awareness, and alignment with enduring patterns, ensuring that myth, memory, and reflective understanding persisted in harmony with the measured flow of time and existence. As the centuries progressed, and the Norse world opened gradually to broader European influences, the quiet currents of change began to touch even the most enduring practices of Norse belief. The arrival and gradual spread of Christianity in Scandinavia did not necessarily erase the old ways abruptly. Rather, it introduced a slow contemplative negotiation between established traditions and new spiritual frameworks. This interaction was subtle, measured, and reflective, emphasizing adaptation, integration, and continuity, rather than violent rupture. Across fjords, villages, and halls, the rhythms of daily life, ritual, labor, oral storytelling, and seasonal observance began to shift, not through sudden edict, but through patient, incremental absorption of new ideas. In rural communities, the adoption of Christian practices often intertwined seamlessly with older customs. Farmers who once left offerings to Freyja for fertile fields might also attend church services, marking the cycles of planting and harvest with prayers that invoked both ancestral understanding and emerging Christian ritual. The timing of festivals, the acknowledgement of celestial and seasonal events, and even the rhythms of daily labor were slowly reframed, blending old and new, while mythic narratives persisted in memory and oral tradition, sometimes reinterpreted through Christian motifs. Yet the contemplative, reflective pace of engagement with the world remained consistent. Spiritual life continued to be observed attentively, with patient awareness of cause, consequence, and moral principle. Even as the sources of authority subtly shifted, the Norse pantheon, once dominant in daily imagination and practice, did not vanish immediately. Echoes of Odin, Thor, Freyja, and the other gods lingered in stories, poetry, and personal reflection. These figures were sometimes recast as symbolic or ancestral presences, their qualities reframed to coexist with Christian ethical and spiritual frameworks. In this way, the transition reflected continuity. The virtues of wisdom, courage, patience, and moral deliberation, so central to Norse cosmology, were preserved and observed, even as theological understanding evolved. Old myths became reflective, contemplative narratives, now intertwined with teachings emphasizing morality, divine oversight, and eternal life, rather than solely the inexorable cycles of fate and cosmic order. Temples and sacred sites were often quietly repurposed, rather than destroyed. Sacred groves, wells, and assembly sites that had once facilitated offerings and rituals for the old gods became spaces for Christian commemoration, prayer, or seasonal observance. The landscape retained its contemplative function, its stillness and natural rhythm, guiding human attention and reflection. The subtle continuity of place allowed communities to maintain an awareness of interconnectedness with the natural and spiritual worlds, even as doctrinal authority shifted. In this patient integration, the essence of reflection, attentiveness, and measured practice, the hallmarks of Norse belief, persisted, now framed within a Christian ethical and spiritual context. Storytelling, too, reflected this quiet adaptation. Skaldic poems and sagas, once focused exclusively on mythic cycles, heroes, and cosmic rhythms, gradually incorporated Christian motifs, saints, and parables. The pace of recitation, the attentive engagement of listeners, and the meditative qualities of repetition and rhythm remained unchanged. Norse memory and narrative practice preserved the contemplative experience, even as content evolved. By maintaining the reflective cadence of oral tradition, the community could integrate new spiritual understanding without losing the depth, patience, and immersive focus that had characterized earlier engagement with myth. The interaction of Norse beliefs and Christianity also reflected subtle psychological and social adaptation. Communities did not abandon established observation of seasonal cycles, labor, and relational practice. They integrated new ethical perspectives into familiar routines. Moral reflection, attentiveness to natural rhythms, and careful observance of continuity persisted, demonstrating that spiritual transformation could be gradual, measured, and deeply reflective. The interplay between old and new reinforced the enduring principle that attention, contemplation, and patient engagement with the rhythms of life remained central to human understanding, regardless of the theological framework. Ultimately, this period of cultural and spiritual encounter exemplified the Norse capacity for continuity amid transformation. Change did not erase the past abruptly, it moved at a deliberate pace, integrating familiar patterns with new insight, preserving reflective practice, and maintaining the slow meditative awareness that had characterized engagement with the cosmos, myth, and daily life. The quiet endurance of attentiveness, the patient observation of cycles, and the reflective integration of morality and meaning continued, demonstrating that even amidst adaptation, the essential rhythm of Norse contemplation endured. In this way, the transition to Christianity did not sever the past but layered it gently with new dimensions, creating a spiritual landscape in which continuity, reflection, and measured transformation remained central, guiding perception, behavior, and the immersive experience of life itself. Even as centuries passed and the Norse world transformed under the influence of Christianity, political consolidation, and social evolution, the narrative symbols and contemplative principles of their mythology continued to echo quietly, leaving enduring traces in the human imagination. The gods, heroes, and cosmic cycles of earlier belief did not vanish with time, rather they persisted as subtle frameworks for reflection, cultural identity, and understanding of the natural and spiritual worlds. From the fjords and forests of Scandinavia to distant regions influenced by exploration, trade, and scholarship, the stories retained a slow meditative presence, inviting reflection on the continuity of life, the cycles of nature, and the interplay between human action and unseen forces. In literature, art, and storytelling, Norse myths have been invoked repeatedly across centuries, sometimes with fidelity to original motifs, and other times through reinterpretation or integration with new cultural frameworks. Writers, poets, and artists have found in these myths a contemplative reservoir of imagery, the measured unfolding of Yggdrasil's roots and branches, the reflective courage of heroes, the inexorable but balanced approach of Ragnarök, and the quiet interplay between gods and humans. Each retelling or artistic rendering preserves the patient, immersive qualities of the original narratives, emphasizing reflection, endurance, and awareness of natural and moral cycles. Even in adaptations that bring action or spectacle to the foreground, the underlying structure retains its contemplative rhythm, inviting readers, viewers, or participants to inhabit the narrative slowly, absorbing its layers and subtleties. Modern scholarship and historical exploration have further perpetuated the calm legacy of Norse belief. Archaeological studies, translations of the poetic and prose Eddas, and comparative analyses of sagas, inscriptions, and material culture reveal the contemplative framework within which these stories were created and transmitted. These investigations illuminate the rhythms of everyday life, ritual practice, moral reflection, and cosmic observation that shaped Norse culture. By engaging with these sources, contemporary audiences can access not only the content of myth, but also the slow, reflective mindset that characterized the Norse approach to existence, fostering a meditative connection to the past that is both instructive and quietly immersive. In popular culture, Norse mythology has provided a reflective lens for exploring human themes, the interplay of fate and choice, the inevitability of change, the persistence of moral and natural cycles, and the contemplative observation of the world. Whether through literature, cinema, visual art, or even educational media, these stories continue to offer a structured, patient engagement with existential questions. The gods and heroes, once central figures in ritual, farming, seafaring, and domestic life, now appear as symbols, archetypes, or narrative touchstones, preserving the meditative ethos of observation, endurance, and integration into broader patterns of meaning. In every retelling, the slow, immersive rhythm remains, inviting audiences to reflect, to inhabit the narrative gradually, and to perceive connections between human experience and the enduring principles of nature and destiny. The persistence of these myths also manifests in the modern interest in cultural heritage, historical reenactment, and the study of pre-Christian Scandinavia. Communities and scholars alike engage in measured observation of traditional practices, seasonal festivals, and interpretive storytelling, honoring the subtle continuity between past and present. These practices emphasize careful attention, reflection, and integration, echoing the patient rhythms of the original Norse world. The endurance of myth, in these contexts, reinforces the understanding that cultural memory is sustained through contemplative, attentive engagement, rather than through mere repetition or superficial invocation. It is the slow, thoughtful preservation of story, principle, and symbolic meaning that allows ancient narratives to resonate in contemporary consciousness. Finally, the enduring influence of Norse mythology illustrates a broader principle that stories rooted in observation, reflection, and the careful integration of human experience with cosmic and natural forces have the power to transcend time. Even as political systems, religious structures, and material culture change, the underlying rhythms of attention, contemplation, and moral awareness persist. By engaging with these narratives, modern audiences can cultivate an understanding of the world that values patience, attentiveness, and the measured recognition of continuity. The gods, heroes, and mythic cycles of the Norse, once intertwined with daily life, ritual, and cosmic reflection, continue to guide imagination and thought, serving as a calm, enduring framework for understanding nature, destiny, and the subtle dimensions of the divine. Thus, the legacy of the Norse gods is not confined to ancient texts or distant fjords. It persists in quiet reflection, in the patient engagement with story, in the careful observation of moral and natural cycles, and in the enduring human fascination with the interplay between mortality, cosmic order, and the divine. Across centuries and continents, the echoes of these myths continue to provide a meditative space, a reflective lens through which modern humanity can consider continuity, transformation, and the subtle enduring principles that shape both life and imagination. In this quiet persistence, Norse mythology maintains its place not only as cultural heritage, but as a calm, immersive, and contemplative guide to observing the world and understanding one's place within it.